This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney, live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio here, looking at some movement on the upside. So the markets here, S&P is up about 0.5%, NASDAQ up 0.8% here. Yields come in kind of noticeably. Got the 10-year yield down 6 basis points, 4.43%. So that's keep that of note. Oil higher again. West Texas Intermediate up about 0.9%, $90.54. So we continue to see moves higher in Europe. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Amy Morse.
All right, thanks, Paul. United Auto Workers President Shawn Fain says the union is expanding its strike against automakers GM and Stellantis by walking out of 38 plants in 20 states.
Across the country, people are going to know that the UAW is ready to stand up for our communities and ready to stand up against corporate greed.
UAW President Fain says Ford was spared additional strikes because that company has met some of the union's demands during negotiations over this past week. The union is pointing to the company's huge recent profits as it seeks wage increases of 36% over 4 years. Senator Robert Menendez has been indicted by federal prosecutors. We get those details from Bloomberg's Michael Barr.
A Democratic senator from New Jersey was indicted by federal prosecutors over allegations that he took hundreds of thousands in bribes from 3 local businessmen to protect their interests and help the Egyptian government. The indictment in federal court in New York alleges that Menendez and his wife engaged in a corruption relationship with the 3 New Jersey associates and businessmen from at least 2018 up until about 2022. In New York, Michael Barr, Bloomberg Radio.
Federal government is less than 10 days away from a shutdown. We get more from Bloomberg government Congress reporter Zach Cohen in Washington.
There were conservative members of the House Republican Conference that would like to see deeper cuts and a halt to Ukraine aid. But what ended up happening was that they stopped these procedural votes, and now we're going into the weekend without a clear path to a stopgap measure that would prevent a government shutdown. In just a couple of days, September 30th is when government funding dries up.
Bloomberg Government's Zach Cohen. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Matt and Paul.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Coming up thank you very much, Amy Morris. Coming up, we're going to get the latest on the auto strike with Keith Naughton. He covers the auto industry in Detroit for Bloomberg News, so we'll get the latest there.
Oh, we'll find out if they're going to keep striking the Bronco plant.
Right.
Because there already was very tight supply on the Bronco.
Yeah.
And it's a sweet truck.
Is it? You've driven it?
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I absolutely love it.
Yeah. They're all over the place. I mean, it's just like the must-thing car to have. So
yeah,
keep an eye on that.
How similar is it to O.J. Simpson's Bronco?
It's not. I mean, the shape is roughly the same. I love that generation of Broncos, but this has, at most a 2.7-liter twin turbocharged V6, and OJ had, I think, the 5-liter
or
V8.
Al Cowlings, I guess.
In that,
I don't know who.
Why are we bringing this up again?
You remember where you were, right? When you saw that, when you were watching that chase?
Yep.
That's like our generation's Kennedy, I feel like.
No.
Yeah, because everyone knows exactly where he or she was when OJ was getting chased.
Mine was when the first space shuttle blew up. That's kind of like people.
Challenger, yeah.
Oh my gosh,
I was in school watching that. Yeah,
I was in college, walking through the Commons, and boom,
traumatizing.
Yeah,
I'm a veteran of the moon landing, so I remember.
Yeah, I remember that
exactly where I was when Neil Armstrong.
All right, we're in different generations. Basically, is my takeaway from that.
Yeah, just pointing that out to John Tucker, like he doesn't know it every day walking around here. Right?
I think of us as the same age, but clearly that's not the case.
Clearly that's not the case, especially at Bloomberg when the average age here is
I was
29.
6 years old, but I remember it.
All right, let's look at these markets here. S&P 500 up 0.5%, getting a little bit more love there on the NASDAQ up 0.9% here. So I'm going to quote Bitcoin because we don't do that anymore. Nobody cares about crypto anymore. 26,700 on Bitcoin. That's for Tom Keene. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
We got a lot of green on the screen here, but the volume is light.
We constantly underestimate the strength of the U.S. consumer.
This is a market that's much more optimistic or bullish than maybe the central bankers are.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
There's still some concern out there in the market that there is room for things to deteriorate a little bit more than what they're indicating.
As small and medium-sized businesses struggle, they don't present as much competition.
The supply chain has still got dislocations globally and here in the U.S.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we will get the latest on the auto strike. It is expanding today. Keith Naughton, he's from Bloomberg News. He's on the ground in Detroit. It is Friday, which means we talk Matt's favorite security asset class, municipal bonds. We're going to do that with Eric Kazansky from Bloomberg Intelligence. So we got all that coming up, and we're going to get the latest on these markets. Let's kick it all off with Mr. John Tucker.
Looks like we're at session highs for stocks right now, and a large part of this has to do with bond yields. They're falling after the latest data that suggests cooling in the biggest part of the economy. That would be services. So that's helping lift stocks, especially the technology shares. S&P 500 halting its three-day slide, still heading toward the worst week since March, though. The Fed's move higher toward higher rates is nothing new and nothing bad, at least according to Martin Malone. He's the chief economist at Oriel.
Real rates of 2%, 2.5%, that's the average of the past half century, not the last 15 years. So they've reset it to a new regime of positive real rates of 2%, 2.5%, and they're there for just the disinflationary factor that it will bring.
Right now, the S&P 500, 20 points higher. That's up 0.5%. 4350 on the index. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 35 points. That's up 0.1%. A tech-heavy NASDAQ 100, 142 points higher. That is close to 1%. We're at 14,837. Two-year yield, 4 basis points lower, 5.09%. The 10-year, 5 basis points lower. That is at 443. And finally, Colorado coach Deion Sanders selling a lot of sunglasses, apparently. Blenders Eyewear says it sold $1.2 million of Coach Prime's Millennia X2 sunglasses that he wore in the pregame shows last week ahead of the Colorado State game. His list of sponsors includes the sunglasses, Nike, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Aflac, and EA Sports as he elevates collegiate sports to a higher level of sportsmanship and academics.
Dude, I just did a Google search, Deion Sanders Prime, and the first thing that pops up is Blender sunglasses ad. So they have obviously got a team of SEO. What is that again? Search engine optimization.
There you go.
They've got a team of those people out there.
Yeah.
Which is really important when you're trying to,
sell sunglasses.
College athletes and educate
all right, Coach
them.
Prime, like I follow this program very carefully. My son graduated from Colorado, so I'm on all the social. It is unbelievable what he has done there. And despite all the money they're paying.
Unbelievably good what
yes,
he's done
they're
there?
2-0. It's unbelievably good.
How do you measure
now,
good?
Oh, it's simple. Wins and losses. And he's 2-0.
No, I'm not. Well, okay.
That's it.
Yeah,
that's it.
that's how I would measure it,
as Coach
too.
Murphy from Harvard says, NCAA Division I football is professional. Coach Murphy from Harvard says the NCAA Division I is professional.
Now, my
It's time to
takeaway
stop.
from that interview that you guys do, an
Right.
excellent interview with the Harvard coach, is that he's not on board with this.
No,
At
of
all.
course. No, he's not at all.
Which is why.
And as many aren't. So, yeah, it won't surprise me if it blows up there, but right now it is great, and they are making money hand over fist with Coach Prime. They sell out every game. They never did that, and they're just doing fine. So.
Now, why is
But they're going to play at Oregon this weekend, big test.
Why is he called Coach Prime?
Because he's prime time, Deion Sanders.
I mean,
That's back from his playing days. You don't know.
I watched him in his playing days. I went and saw him play live, but I just don't remember calling him prime time all. I feel like that may have been something someone said once or twice, and now we think that that's what he was.
No, he's
every
always
day.
been prime time, Deion Sanders. All right, let's get back to the car makers, the strikes, because General Motors and Stellantis face walkouts at 38 more facilities as talks with their workers' union failed to make headway, even as Ford Motor Company was spared the escalation after making progress in the negotiations. Let's get the latest from Detroit. Keith Naughton, autos industry reporter for Bloomberg News, joins us here. Keith, so there's a lot of movement today. Keith, kind of summarize it kind of what we're seeing coming out of Detroit?
Yeah, all of this just happened. It's still breaking, actually. What Sean Fain, the UAW president, just announced on Facebook Live is that he's expanding the strike at GM and Stellantis to all of their parts facilities in the United States. That's 38 new facilities in 20 states. But they are not expanding the strike at Ford. They will continue to strike the one plant at Ford that they struck a week ago, the Ford Bronco plant in Michigan. They feel like they're making, as he said, real progress with Ford in talks, including restoring the cost of living payments that were eliminated in 2009, and also eliminating some tiers for parts plant workers. But at GM and Stellantis, they are not making that kind of progress. So he is trying to inflict more pain. And by going after the parts centers like this, Mopar parts centers, that actually will hurt the dealers and the owners, because it means that parts won't be getting to dealerships for repairs and service.
It's
going
to be painful. So, I mean, because Stellantis, they really only make now Jeeps and Ram trucks. But if you bought a Dodge, you probably want to get, an OEM Mopar shaker intake.
Sure, who doesn't?
Or a catback exhaust. I was actually thinking about ordering one of each of those, to be honest with you, like next month. So hopefully there's a little bit of stock left there. Are they going to actually build any more Dodge vehicles, Keith? I mean, I know they have, the Durango's a good seller, and they've got the, what's the new one? The Hornet. But the Banshee concept looks so, like, not real life to me. Is that ever going to come out?
I don't know, Matt, but there are still Dodge models out there, and they have said that they are going to electrify their muscle cars. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, so far that's just talk. We haven't seen Tim Kuniskis really back up that statement. It would be cool if they had electric muscle cars, but it feels very pie in the sky.
I actually bought a Ram truck.
Yeah?
A pickup truck for my son.
Nice.
Yeah, I did not drive it. I did not really want it in my driveway. But nevertheless, that's what he wanted because he needed a truck. So that's what he's got. So
what a good dad you are.
Yep.
In terms of the, just to clarify on Ford, they're still striking at the Bronco plant. That's in Wayne, Michigan, right? And they don't they also build the Ranger there? Are they striking?
They do. They build the Ranger. They're both on the same platform, as you might know, Matt. Yeah. So they build the Ranger pickup truck, the midsize, and they build the Bronco in that plant. So this gives an opening to because they've also taken down GM's midsize trucks, the Colorado and the Canyon. So it gives an opening to market leader Toyota Tacoma to grab even more market share.
Which, I mean, you'd already thought they're going to have a great time with the new Tacoma because they offer a stick. And the Ford people are like, nah, we don't need a manual transmission anymore.
Hey, Keith, we were just talking to Kevin Tynan, who covers the autos for Bloomberg Intelligence, and he said basically, from the car company's perspective, yeah, we'll give you a pay increase and we'll negotiate on that. But we need flexibility because we're only making 15.5 million cars. The days of 17.5 million cars, those are over, and we don't really know how this whole EV thing is. So we need flexibility, and we're not going to negotiate on that. And that's how it's got to be. Do you think that's kind of where we'll shake out here?
Well, it's interesting because Ford really pushed that the hardest before talks started. You might recall that EV sales started slowing down this year. I mean, they're still growing, but not at the rate they were. And so Ford is now leaning harder into hybrids. They've said they need flexibility to dial up and down their internal combustion vehicles and their electric vehicles and their hybrid vehicles as market demand for all three of those powertrains develops. And Ford is making the most progress in talks. So Ford put out a statement right after Sean Fain's Facebook Live saying, yes, we've made progress, but there's still a lot of work to do, and this stuff is all interconnected. So, for example, just because you have resolved or apparently resolved the COLA issue doesn't mean you are close to a resolution of other serious issues. So I think the flexibility thing is very important to Ford. They are living it at the moment. They've had to dial back their EV production plans. So if they are making progress at Ford and Ford wants flexibility, I'd say that's still very much on the table.
So in terms of the expansion, Keith, it's the parts plants that are getting hit, and you mentioned the mid-sized pickup trucks. What is it going to take to push them to strike at the Rouge, or where they make the F-150, or where GM makes their Silverado? Where does GM make the Silverado? And
it escapes me. Just maybe John Tucker knows. I don't know. Who knows?
I don't know, but the
GM
big
makes both in the United States and Mexico. GM has two sources for Silverado.
True. My Silverado, I got the ZR2. Remember that?
Of course,
that came from Mexico. It was stuck there for a long time, but
and given that Ford's been spared an expansion of the strike, it seems less likely that the F-150 plant, the Rouge, there's one in Kansas City as well. There's also an F-Series plant in Ohio. Kentucky. It seems less likely that those plants will go down. Investors certainly seem to be reacting that way because Ford stock is way up since Sean Fain's speech, whereas GM Stellantis is not.
All right. So, Keith, I ask, I'm going to ask this every time we chat with you. Is there any feel in Detroit about how long this may go? I mean, is this the smart people who kind of live this cycle after cycle after cycle? Is there any sense of kind of how long this might go?
Well, I do think, what just happened affects perceptions on that. And it feels like Ford is getting close. Remember, Ford this week also settled with its Canadian union, Unifor, and Ford cited that in their statement. So they may be close at Ford. They certainly don't sound close at GM and Stellantis.
All right, Keith, thanks so much for joining us. As always, appreciate getting the latest there. There's lots of movement on that. And we get the
thank goodness my Challenger got built last weekend.
I know. That's what we're all saying here. I mean, now we just got to get it on a train and get it down here. So
it's in Buffalo, apparently.
Oh, it's in Buffalo. That's better than it's in.
So I don't know. That's not too far from Ontario, right? But there.
No. Yeah. All right, let's switch gears. It's Friday. And what we talk about on Fridays is the municipal bond market. Why? Because the Focus on Munis is brought to you by Build America Mutual. Build America Mutual insures U.S. municipal bonds that finance essential American infrastructure and provides guaranteed income to improve any portfolio. Be part of building America. Invest in BAM insured municipal bonds.
BAM!
BAM. There you go. Eric Kozaski joins us. He covers all the municipal bond stuff. He's a strategist over there at Bloomberg Intelligence. So, Eric, give us some sense of how performance has been year to date and kind of what your conversation you're having with clients here about the municipal bond space.
We're acting like a therapist right now, I'd say. A lot of people laying on our couch trying to make some sense of the shell shock that went on in the markets last week in the fixed income space. Look, every time that you have a backup of rates in this amount, it's going to catch people off guard, regardless if they sort of had the intuition the Fed was going to raise or not. And what we're seeing in the muni market is a lot of people were caught off guard. You talked about returns. We're down about 1.3% this month. On the positive side, munis are still up on the year, about 23 basis points. Not great, but outperformance versus treasuries. So that's what we want to see.
I actually had someone recommending munis to me on the open this morning on Bloomberg Television.
Did you take any down?
And no, I'm just saying.
Oh, okay.
A strategist saying we think munis are very attractive right now. Not a financial advisor telling me and my wife to back into munis.
Yeah.
No, but is it this a similar situation, Eric? To across the yield space, it looks like we could be at the highs of the cycle here. So even if you don't get capital appreciation on the price, you're still sitting on a sweet coupon.
Yeah, look, every time that we think that we've hit a peak, we tend to re-peak. So that argument goes out the window. But I think right now that what we're sort of talking to clients about is just, that old adage, right? Keep it simple, stupid. KISS, really. In the first 2 years of the yield curve, you're just better off with treasuries. It doesn't make a lot of sense to trudge into munis in the beginning of the yield curve. One, because of the inversion, and two, because spreads are just still too tight. Obviously, the munis have their advantage, and to the point you're making, Matt, look more attractive as you get further out the yield curve and a little bit lower in credit, but just not a lot of sense up front.
How much do munis actually trade, in the secondary market after, the initial sale compared to, say, investment grade bonds or treasuries?
By far and large, liquidity in our space over the last several years has become more constrained, more of a by appointment market. You have this initial flurry after a new issue bond comes where things change hands, but then they tend to go away and just sort of get tucked into accounts. By the numbers, though, average daily trading volume from the MSRB for our space, it's about 10 to 12 billion. So not insignificant, but certainly there's more demand than there are bonds available still.
How's the new issue calendar look?
Pretty slow, as you can imagine. I'm sure a lot of things got knocked back this week with the pop in rates. But as we've talked about before, there's a certain amount of spend that needs to get done in our space. And I think, look, the muni market existed 20, 30 years ago when rates were much higher. It's going to exist as rates get higher now. It's just a lot of people are sort of getting comfortable to that new normal.
Are all the investment banks, do they still have municipal bond departments?
As far as we know, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know if anybody had pulled back. I mean, we've seen, at some point, I remember some investment banks from time to time do pull back in the muni space.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think as we get towards the end of the year, you might see some of that trimming begin to happen as people reevaluate their business plans for the next cycle. We haven't seen any sort of wholesale exit on anyone surprising so far. But, as we see sort of less and less bidders show up for competitive deals, that signals to us that there is a little bit more tightening of capital allocated to the space.
How about the credit quality out there in the municipal space? I know during the pandemic, I thought that would be a real problem. But you explained to us now there's so much stimulus out there that the cities and towns and municipalities are just fine.
Yeah, I mean, completely confounding. If you asked me in the beginning of the pandemic, I thought we were going to have a lot more defaults than actually happened. And like to your point, we had a lot of stimulus come in and sort of save the day. As that rolls off, I think it's going to be a slow problem over the next several fiscal periods as things play out, especially in cities where people aren't coming back in mass. Look, quite positively, it's good to see MTA numbers rebound slightly, still not at pre-pandemic, but as people are forced to come back into the offices or that becomes more of a normal, that's always good for public transit. So hopefully some of those trends will take hold.
I choose to come back into the office. Eric Kazatsky.
Exactly, and I choose as well, except for today.
Except for today, yeah, I hear you.
I've never worked from home.
I know.
Not one day.
Badge of honor.
Same
right
thing
there.
for John Tucker, Rich Truman, some of the
They had some good lunches here during the pandemic.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It took care of us. Eric Kazatsky, Senior Municipal Strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. All right, so the Scat Pack car thing, it's in the country, it's in Buffalo?
So according to my dealer, and this was day before yesterday, they said we're tracking the car, it's in Buffalo, it's on the rails. And I think what they do is they send it to a warehouse in Jersey.
Nice.
And from there it goes onto a truck to the dealership, which in this case is in Brooklyn. So,
all right, we're getting there, folks. We'll keep track of the Dodge Challenger with the Scat
Pack. Just go yourself and go get it. They don't allow that.
That's not allowed.
That's not allowed.
But that's like illegal.
All right, all right. We're gonna stay on top of this story because it needs to be told. I think we're gonna have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now. Steve Rappaport.
Paul, United Auto Workers President Shawn Fain says the union will expand strikes against GM and Stellantis at noon.
This expansion will also take our fight nationwide. We will be everywhere from California to Massachusetts, from Oregon to Florida. And we will keep going, keep organizing, and keep expanding the stand-up strike as necessary. Across the country, people are going to know that the UAW is ready to stand up for our communities and ready to stand up against corporate greed.
Fain, in a Facebook Live video, said the UAW will not widen the strike against Ford based on progress in negotiations. A judge says Starbucks illegally banned pro-union messages on its cups. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti has more.
A National Labor Relations Board judge says the coffee chain violated workers' rights by preventing them from marking orders with Union Strong and other advocacy phrases requested by customers. Starbucks claimed the prohibition was a legitimate effort to bar political or personal discourse at work. The judge rejected that argument, noting the company previously promoted merchandise with messages supporting LGBTQ rights and disability rights. More than 360 Starbucks stores voted to unionize, but none have reached labor agreements with the company. Gina Cervetti, Bloomberg Radio.
Thanks, Gina. Microsoft and Activision Blizzard appear to be closing in on clearing the last hurdle for their $69 billion merger. The UK's antitrust regulator signaled it will approve the plan based on new concessions offered by Microsoft. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. The NASDAQ 100 right now gaining. It is up 0.9%, pairing some of the earlier gains. Apple climbing as its latest iPhones and watches, they went on sale today. Treasury 10-year yields dropping after briefly topping 4.5% for the first time since 2007. So that's based on some of the data we saw today. A gauge of inflation activity slowed to 2.98% in August. That's according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York City. And S&P data also shows the services sector cooled off. This is particularly helping the tech stocks. In the S&P 500, the best performing industry groups right now, information technology as well as communication services. S&P 500 overall 21 points higher. That is up 0.5% at 43.51. Stopping the 3-day slide. We'll see if that holds up. Dow Jones Industrial Average 30 points higher, and again the Nasdaq 100 up 131 points. That's a rise of 0.9%. 2-year yield 5.1%, down 3 basis points. The 10-year 443. That's a 6 basis point decline there. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt and Paul.
JT, thank you very much for that. Now, yesterday, Paul and I were talking with a gentleman who said, you know, one of the big problems in terms of battery production is that a lot of the stuff is mined elsewhere, and then most of it is processed in China. China. So our next guest is hoping to change that a little bit. Navaid Alam joins us. He's president and CEO of Evolution, and they are working on a cobalt processing plant in Yuma, Arizona, which should supply, when it's up to speed, about 1 million batteries. What, a year, Navaid? Is that an annual figure that you want to be, cobalt for 1 million batteries a year?
Yes, that's correct, Matt. 1 million a year. You know, right now there's 30 cobalt processing facilities in China and 0 in North America. So, you know, we need to catch up here. That's And, you know, luckily we started this process a few years ago before the IRA and the other laws, and now we're catching a nice tailwind. So it's going really well.
Do you get any financing benefits from that, tax breaks from that legislation? I mean, are there subsidies that you can take advantage of here?
Yeah, absolutely. Though I will say we were going to do this plant without those subsidies, but it's a great help for us, for sure.
So how much are you going to spend to build this plant? I know that Yuma, because I read in a local newspaper, expects to have a ton of revenue sort of as a knock-on effect, jobs and everything. But how much are you going to spend to build it, and when are you going to be done making it?
Ballpark around $300 million, and it'll be done in 2026, we think.
All right, so what actually happens at a cobalt processing facility, and how's that part of the whole battery situation?
So cobalt is a really important metal for EV batteries, for thermal regulation, and for energy density, and for giving you long range and good cold weather performance. It's also extremely important in aerospace and defense. It's used in hypersonic missiles and stealth bombers. So it's a really critical material for the United States to have self-sufficiency in. So what we do is we take cobalt hydroxide, so already processed cobalt that is processed in Africa, and then it'll come here to the United States instead of going to China. And you know what the Chinese do is they just process it there and then send it back to the United States for the cars here, such as Tesla and other electric automakers. But we want to skip the China step, just bring it straight here to America, process it into cobalt sulfate, which is the salt that goes into the cathode portion of the EV battery, and sell it to the new plants that have been announced in the United States by General Motors, LG, Samsung, Ford. You know, they're spending billions of dollars building these, what they call battery precursor plants. They're going to get nickel sulfate, cobalt sulfate, manganese sulfate, and put it all together and make a battery pack.
Now, I've seen, I guess, a rendering of the plant in Yuma, and one of the things you immediately notice, Paul, check this out.
Yeah.
Giant solar facility, even bigger than the actual processing plant. So I know you guys want to be carbon neutral. This is all going to be powered by the sun?
Yes, indeed. Yuma County is the sunniest county in the United States, so it's pretty easy, we think, to do the full-on solar power. 100% solar, no greenhouse gases, no propane, no diesel. So we also are going to be benefiting the local farmers by selling them back some of our excess solar production at cost. They're losing a lot of hydro power from the lower levels on the Colorado River. So they're very excited about our coming in and building this facility there.
Well, I heard that, you know, you like Yuma not only because, I guess apparently your wife is from Yuma, for one thing.
That's right.
It's also very sunny, low cost of living, low regulatory kind of hassle there. But it's close to, like, all the used batteries coming back out of California is what I read. So are you recycling cobalt there?
We will. We intend to recycle as well. So, you know, our first phase is to build a sulfate facility, which is sort of, I think, the easier thing. It's a very established technology around the world. As I said, there's 30 of these plants in China. And then as more and more batteries are spent and used up, we want to recycle some of those into turning them around and getting the cobalt back out of them. And then lastly, we want to add a cobalt metal facility for aerospace and defense. So that's part of the strategic reserve announced by the president under the Defense Production Act.
How do you think you will be able to compete against the Chinese? They obviously have much greater scale, presumably government support to some level. How do you think about the competitive environment?
Well, there is no cobalt mined in China either. They all take it out of Africa. So we're competing with them in Africa. We're going to bring it here instead of taking it to China. And so logistically, we save money. The other great thing about Yuma County and where we are, it's right on the border of California and Mexico. So we're going to come through the port of Long Beach or the port of Ensenada with our inputs. And it's only 3 hours by truck from Ensenada or Long Beach. So I think logistically, it's a great spot. We're on Interstate 8. We're on the UP Railroad. So we picked it also because logistics are important in these kinds of deals.
What from a competitive perspective, again, will you be competing on price to your customers here? Can you, because of the lower, presumably the lower logistics costs, if nothing else,
right? It doesn't have to ship all the way from China.
Yeah, well, look, it's a combination of price, and we would have been competing on price initially, but more now. There's tariffs on Chinese sulfate. There's the IRA regulations about Chinese inputs that come in to the EV battery supply chain. There's a lot of new laws that are sort of helping us compete on price. So we may be able to charge a higher price than we might have ordinarily, if there were none of these laws.
All right. It's, I think, a fascinating story, and we're finally starting to see movement.
Maybe it's because it's Climate Week, and we saw a bunch of these folks this week.
No, I mean, in terms of bringing processing here, because Naved, I don't know how much you talk with other people in the kind of battery supply chain, but I imagine we must be trying to bring a lot more processing of cobalt, lithium, and rare earths to the U.S. at some point, right?
Yes, it's all happening. It's hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. Real, team effort. Lots of big corporations, as I mentioned, LG, General Motors, Samsung. They've announced billion-dollar plants in Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, even Arizona. LG is building a $5.5 billion plant just up the road in Phoenix, just south of Phoenix. So that is going to help us sell our product into the United States.
Yeah, so it's moving.
Yeah.
The infrastructure, the supply chain is moving here.
That's right. All right, Naved, thanks so much for joining us. Naved Alam, he is a president and CEO of Evolution. They're getting into the battery business and the processing of all the cobalt and all that kind of stuff, which, again, it does feel, Matt, like, the pieces really are moving here as we keep this stuff, or reshore it, onshore it, however you want to.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the IRA, that legislation is a huge part of it. As Naved said, they were already working on it before that. But, one of the things that the president has tried to do with the tax benefits you get from buying a car made in the U.S. and assembled in the U.S. with parts that are a lot of times need to be produced in the U.S. He's trying to bring that supply chain here onshore.
Yeah, that became a thing during the pandemic. To the extent people, didn't see that coming. The whole onshoring argument got a lot of momentum back there in the early mid part of that pandemic, when supply chains really seized up on a global basis, and it kind of brought into the question, this whole just-in-time inventory that I think a couple of generations of business people have been kind of raised on. Now it's kind of just-in-case inventory, so people are rethinking that as well. Looking at the markets here, holding on to the gains. S&P 500 up 0.5%. NASDAQ up with, we're up about 0.9%. So kind of keeping those gains there. On the yield front, 10-year Treasury 4.42% off 7 basis points there. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Amy Mars.
All right, thank you, Paul. The United Auto Workers Union is ready to expand its strike against at least 2 of the big 3 automakers. UAW President Sean Fain.
At noon Eastern today, all parts distribution centers at General Motors and Stellantis will be on strike. This will impact these 2 companies' repairs operations, and our message to the consumer is simple. The way to fix the frustrating customer experience is for the companies to end price gouging.
Fain says there is still more work to do with Ford, but they were able to make progress there, so they won't expand the strikes against Ford plants. However, they have not gotten much traction with talks at the table with GM and Stellantis, so those strikes are expanding as of noon today. That's less than a half hour from now. Senator Robert Menendez from New Jersey under indictment by federal prosecutors over bribery offenses in connection with a relationship with 3 businessmen. U.S. prosecutors say a search of the Menendez home turned up $100,000 $400,000 in gold bars and $480,000 in hidden cash. That indictment includes Menendez and his wife. It was unsealed this morning. We're days away now from a government shutdown. Negotiations are at a standstill, and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has sent members home for a 3-day long weekend. Bloomberg's Ed Baxter with the latest.
McCarthy's efforts to get a government funding bill have blown up as he got ambushed by two ultra-conservatives, Eli Crane and once loyal supporter Marjorie Taylor Greene.
I've been very clear about take the Ukraine money out of the defense bill and put it in a separate funding bill so that members like me can vote no.
And others can vote yes if they want. McCarthy says still time.
I know it's not pretty, but this country's too great to quit on.
9 days with 3 off now, and the Senate also would need to do something. I'm Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom. This Bloomberg Business Flash. Stocks appear to finally have found a floor, trading higher as the S&P 500 recovers from its biggest sell-off since March. However, both the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ Composite Index, they do remain on track to log a third straight weekly decline. Comments from the Fed this week that it's prepared to raise rates further if necessary. This kind of muddied the investment waters. Jonathan Stubbs at Berenberg says this new rate environment will take some getting used to.
The transition is going to be challenging, and to digest higher rates for longer will take time and presents many headwinds, and we need to find some tailwinds to counter that, and they're not quite so easy to see right now.
As yields dip slightly from the highest since 2007, shares of mega-cap tech stocks rising. You have Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, Tesla, NVIDIA, all higher. And finally, some more Fed speak today. Two Federal Reserve officials said at least one more interest rate hike is possible, that borrowing costs may need to stay higher for longer for the central bank to ease inflation back to the 2% target. So I don't think there's anything new there. S&P 500 right now up 25 points. That's up 0.6%, 43.55 in the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 75 points. That's up 0.2%. And the NASDAQ 100 right now up 152 points, just above 1%. Two-year yield 5.09%, down 4 basis points. 10-year yield down 6 basis points. That's at 442. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt and Paul.
John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We are streaming live on YouTube, so go over to youtube.com and search for Bloomberg Radio. It is United Nations General Assembly Week here in New York, and we got lots of stuff happening, lots of terrible traffic. But one of the key areas is Russia and various sanctions on Russia as it relates to the Ukraine war. One area that is going to come up for discussion very soon is going to be ban on Russian diamonds. So we want to get to the bottom of that, and we can do that with our next guest, Ankur Daga, CEO of Angara. And Ankur, thanks so much for joining us again here. Talk to us about, just remind us what you do at Angara.
Sure. So at Angara, we are a vertically integrated online jeweler. So we do everything from cutting and polishing gemstones to designing jewelry to manufacturing jewelry to retailing over the web in over 30 countries.
All right. So I had a question on a slightly different, before we get into that business, on a slightly different thing. I always kind of wonder, isn't Wharton the grad school?
No.
And I see some people who do the undergraduate thing at Wharton, but isn't that Penn?
Yeah, so Wharton is one of the schools in Penn, but it is undergrad and grad school.
All right, so you go to Wharton, you study finance there and entrepreneurship, then you go get your MBA from Harvard. I've heard of it.
Trade school.
And then you decide, I'm going to become a jeweler?
Yeah, so interestingly, I grew up in the jewelry business, so I've kind of played with gemstones since the age of 5. I always thought I would never come into the industry because it is pretty antiquated and old-fashioned, as you can imagine. But after Wharton, I went to McKinsey. My largest project was turning around a major jewelry retailer, and that's when I fell in love with the trade again. I saw a lot of opportunity, especially online. So here we are.
So I mean, you could have just gone straight to the jewelry business. You didn't need to stop. You didn't need to stop at McKinsey. You didn't need to stop at Harvard, right? But what did you learn at those places that gave you an edge now in this business?
So I think the industry is one of the most fragmented industries out there. So when you compare it to any other part of retail, so for example, Signet, which is the #1 jeweler in the U.S., only has less than 10% market share. You compare it to something like a Best Buy, which has a much more dominant position. So the idea was, how do we structure the industry in a way that allows us to get to that scale where we can really dominate the industry?
All right, so one of the news items that you and I were talking about before is Russia. Russia supplies a lot of diamonds, and they're going to, I guess the G7 is going to put some sanctions on it or something like that? What's happening there?
Yeah, so in a couple of weeks, there's likely to be a ban announced, and the ban would be for all Russian diamonds. So just as a precursor to this, April 2022, the Biden administration issued an executive order to ban Russian diamonds. So this has already been done by the US and UK. The key difference here is twofold. One is instead of 2 countries, it's 7 countries. And second, and I think far more importantly, is the previous ban was only on rough. Now, the thing is, for rough diamonds, those get exported typically from Russia to India, China, or Antwerp. And in this case, the cutting and polishing happens in those centers, and those are then substantially transformed goods, so they are no longer considered Russian diamonds. So that previous ban really had no teeth. This is very different because they're thinking about prohibiting cutting and polished Russian diamonds from entering any of the G7, which is really 65% of the total market demand.
This is what we do with Russian goods, that we want to put sanctions on them, so you know we're serious. Right. But they can send the goods to India or China to get finished, and then we'll buy them. Yeah, like you know? Oil. Exactly. Yeah.
Right, so how big is Russia in terms of being a supplier?
So Russian diamond market is roughly $4 billion. There was $4 billion in exports back in 2021 before the war. Just to compare that to the overall GDP, Russian GDP in 2021 was 1.7 trillion. So you're really talking about 0.2% of the market. Yep. And to the previous point, it is more optics than reality because 0.2% is a pretty small part of the overall market to change.
All right, so where do you typically get your diamonds?
So we typically buy from site holders, which are their customers of De Beers. So typically Botswana Sort is our #1 source. So we started avoiding Russian diamonds back in 2022 when the ban in the US was announced preemptively. So for us, it doesn't really affect us because we don't source Russian diamonds in any case.
How fungible are these stones? I mean, how would you know if a diamond came, cut, polished, finished out of Russia? It doesn't have any kind of like microchip inside it. There's no tag, right?
It's hard, and that's why this ban is going to be especially difficult to enforce. But the idea behind it is really implementing blockchain technology and ledger systems throughout the supply chain to be able to figure out what's coming from Russia versus elsewhere. And honestly, I think it's actually kind of great because all of a sudden traceability becomes enforced in the diamond industry, which is great. So we can make sure we don't get any conflict diamonds, blood diamonds, and the like.
Talk to us about the diamond market today. How's it been over the last year or two? Are diamonds more expensive, less expensive?
So natural diamonds have been getting crushed. So
really?
Since their peak in mid-2022, they are down roughly 35 to 50% in terms of value. A few reasons. One is that there is a natural lack of demand in China as well as the US, which are the 2 major consumers of diamonds. People are going out a lot more. They're eating out, traveling, and a lot of that consumption power is going there. But I think the bigger issue is lab-grown diamonds.
And you guys do lab-grown diamonds, right?
We have launched lab-grown. And so a few interesting statistics on lab-grown. Back in 2018, it was like 2% of the market. This last year, 36% of engagement rings sold were lab-grown engagement rings. Wow. Over half of current diamond distribution in the US is lab-grown. So really, they've taken off. It's a perfect substitute, chemically, physically, optically the same, at discounts ranging anywhere from 75 to 90% of their natural equivalents.
So
and
basically,
you can't tell the difference.
I get my wife a lab-grown diamond. If I give her a 2-carat honker on a platinum ring, she will be just as pleased as if I gave her like a real blood diamond.
Well, not a blood diamond per se, but a natural diamond, let's call it.
Yes.
Yeah, so absolutely.
And she takes it down to Wilson Jewelers in Scarsdale. They're not going to know the difference.
They will not. The only way you can know the difference is if you send it to the GIA or IGI or another certification lab. And there's small traces of nitrogen in natural diamonds that do not exist in lab-grown. That's really the only way you'll be able to tell the difference. But visually, you can't tell.
I'm never buying a real diamond again.
Yeah, I mean, Boy, if I'd known that back in the day.
They didn't have them that good.
I know. Trust me. Ankur Daga, thanks so much for joining us. Ankur Daga, CEO of Angara, talking about the diamond business. Fascinating, this whole lab-grown thing and kind of how it impacts the market. And now you get sanctions coming down on Russia. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Steve Rappaport.
Paul, the United Auto Workers are 10 minutes away from their next move in a targeted strike. UAW President Shawn Fain.
But noon Eastern today, all parts distribution centers at General Motors and Stellantis will be on strike. This will impact these two companies' repairs operations, and our message to the consumer is simple. The way to fix the frustrating customer experience is for the companies to end price gouging. Invest these record profits into stable jobs and sustainable wages and benefits. It's that simple.
Fain, in a Facebook Live video, said the strike against Ford will not expand because of progress in negotiations. Microsoft and Activision Blizzard appear on the cusp of completing their merger. The $69 billion deal is set to clear its last regulatory hurdle after the UK antitrust watchdog signaled it will accept concessions offered by Microsoft. More on that from Bloomberg's Ruth David.
Microsoft has agreed to give French video game publisher Ubisoft cloud streaming rights for Activision's very popular games. And that was one of the big issues that CMA was blocking this deal on, because their argument was that they wanted a market for consumers that was not tied up to any one company.
Thanks, Ruth. Striking writers in Hollywood studios will meet for a third straight day in the hope of ending a standoff that began in May. The two sides have been divided on issues of pay, writing staff sizes on shows, and the use of AI in the creation of scripts. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport. This is Bloomberg. Stay tuned for more Bloomberg Markets coming up.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Matt Miller and Paul Sweeney here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Stocks holding their gains. The S&P 500 up about 0.4%. S&P, the Nasdaq up about 0.75% on the yield front. The 2-year Treasury is off about 4 basis points. We'll call it 5.1%. The 10 years yielding 4.44%. So still inverted, that's for sure. WTI crude oil up about 50 cents, $90.16 a barrel. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul.
Boom.
New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez and his wife Nadine are facing bribery charges. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams with the Southern District of New York alleges that the two took bribes from New Jersey business executives in exchange for influence.
The indictment alleges that through that relationship, the senator and his wife accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars of bribes in exchange for Senator Menendez using his power and influence to protect and to enrich those businessmen and to benefit the government of Egypt.
Williams says their investigation is not yet over. Menendez says he's being falsely accused. The Supreme Court could face new questions about its ethics. ProPublica is reporting Justice Clarence Thomas has appeared at recent events sponsored by the billionaire-backed Koch network in hopes he'd be a fundraising draw. Bloomberg Government's Zach Cohen with details.
There's an appearance here of Justice Thomas being used as a fundraising draw for a conservative group that typically advocates before the high court.
Bloomberg Government's Zach Cohen. The Koch network says Justice Thomas was not present for fundraising conversations at the events he attended. House Republicans are barreling toward a government shutdown in less than 10 days. Speaker Kevin McCarthy sent lawmakers home after failing to reach agreement on how much to cut spending. Brown University political scientist Wendy Schiller says this ends one of two ways.
One is that the shutdown, lasts a little while and then people come to the table and they resolve it because, there are probably 150 votes in the Republican Party that want to see the government stay open, that do not want a shutdown. Kevin McCarthy, on the other hand, doesn't play this right, could be subject to a sort of oust the speaker movement. And if that happens, then we have chaos. Then the shutdown could last a lot longer. And that's the nightmare scenario.
Brown University's Wendy Schiller spoke on Bloomberg Surveillance. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Paul and Matt.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Here's one that jumped out at me because, you talk about maybe stagflation or deflation. I'll tell you where there's still inflation. That's in the value of professional sports teams. Yeah. A chunk of the Golden State Warriors. That's basketball, Matt. The National Basketball Association.
That's Steph Curry, right?
That's Steph Curry. Most successful team over the last decade is up for sale, according to people familiar with the matter. A group of minority investors, about 10% of the company, looking to sell their stake here. They're talking about a valuation of $7 billion for the entire company. A transaction at that mark would make the Warriors one of the world's most valuable teams in any sport. Only a handful of teams, including the New York Knicks, Dallas Cowboys, Washington Commanders, and Manchester United could rival the Warriors in terms of highest sports valuation, although I would say the Yankees are still the highest valued franchise. But some big numbers for pro sports. It just keeps going up. And
I wonder why they don't throw the Yankees in
I don't know.
the story.
I don't know.
I mean, the Yankees must be worth $20 billion, right?
No, they're probably worth, they're definitely worth north of 7. Is it 10? Is it 11? Something like that. Manchester.
Dude, Twitter's worth $44 billion, so the Yankees.
Yeah, well, it depends who the buyer is, I guess.
Are the Giants worth less now? Because I've heard they lost again.
They did lose again, but that doesn't matter. You're the Giants.
What are they, 0-2?
No, they're, are they 0-2? I can't even remember what they are. No, they won't, I don't know.
They lost their first game, right?
40, yeah, big time.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know, they're 0-2, I guess. I don't know. We'll figure out. Rich Truman will help us out. So we'll see. But just the value of sports, it just kind of continues to be crazy. And then you see it over there in Europe, in England with the soccer. You got all these Americans and American celebrities going over and buying anything that's not nailed down across Europe in terms of the football. So sports inflation
I want to buy
continues.
a professional pickleball.
I tell you, there are leagues. There are investors out there. There's companies
for
out
sure.
there. Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to flame out very, very shortly. Think of racquetball back in the 80s. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
We got a lot of green on the screen here, but the volume is light.
We constantly underestimate the strength of the U.S. consumer.
This is a market that's much more optimistic or bullish than maybe the central bankers are.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
There's still some concern out there in the market that there is room for things to deteriorate a little bit more than what they're indicating.
As small and medium-sized businesses struggle, they don't present as much competition.
The supply chain has still got dislocations globally and here in the U.S.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to check in with Matt Hendrickson. He's the senior equity analyst covering medical technology at Bloomberg Intelligence. We're going to talk about a company, Boston Scientific. They recently had their investor day, and they got a lot of new products coming out, so we'll get the latest there. Plus, it looks like Microsoft is actually going to be able to buy this Activision thing. They're getting some love from the UK regulators. We'll check in with Jennifer Rhee. She's a senior antitrust analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. And then we're going to talk about drones and the use in the military, because it is certainly front page news there, especially in Ukraine. Pretty extensive use of drones. All right, let's kick this whole thing off with Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much. And Paul, we are off session highs, but still green on the screen as we wrap up a turbulent week for the U.S. equity market. You mentioned Microsoft, that stock down 0.2%. Activision, though, higher by 1.7%. Stocks are snapping back as bond yields fall at the end of a jittery week that saw investors positioning for a higher for longer Federal Reserve stance. 10-year yield right now, 4.43%. We've got the 2-year now yielding 5.10%. S&P up 16. That is a gain of 0.4%. The Dow up 33, now up 0.1%. And the Nasdaq Composite Index up 93, higher by about 0.7%. Spot gold up $8 the ounce to $19.27, a gain there of 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude 89.88 a barrel. WTI up by about 0.3%. As for the market backdrop, Gitu Sharma is the founder of Alpha's Future, and she was a guest right here on Bloomberg Markets.
We are looking at a little bit of recovery today, but I think that's partly driven by just the sharp sell-off we've already had. And also we saw some data that seemed to imply that maybe the economy is slowing down. So there's some relief from that as well.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. As we have been reporting, General Motors and Stellantis face walkouts at 38 more facilities as talks with their workers' union failed to make headway, while Ford was spared the escalation after making progress in the negotiations. Ford shares up now by 2.5%, General Motors down 0.1%, and Stellantis higher now by 0.6%. Stellantis, the parent of Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Fiat brands, among many, many others. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Looking at the markets, we got some green, as Charlie is just reporting. That's a good thing. Let's see where the action is under the hood with some particular names. We can do that with Emily Graffeo. She covers the markets for Bloomberg News, and Emily joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Emily, what are you looking at?
So I'm looking at Scholastic, because those shares are down 15%.
I used to cover the stock. I pitched the IPO back in 92. I pitched the IPO in 92. We got beat out by Goldman Sachs.
You're going to know a lot more about it than I do.
Emily, I think, is young enough that we can find an answer to my original question. So my great-grandfather published My Weekly Reader, which when me and Paul were kids, everybody read that in like second grade, My Weekly Reader. Did you guys have that?
That doesn't ring a bell.
No, maybe they don't do it anymore.
My Weekly Reader, yeah. It's how you learned how to read.
Well, I remember the book fairs.
Yes.
And I was actually surprised.
Book
so
clubs.
they had earnings, and the CEO said, "We expect participation at our in-person book fairs to remain strong in fiscal 2024. I didn't realize that kids were still going to book fairs in their schools, but that was a great memory. But
yes,
it was,
book fairs and book clubs.
Yeah.
It's a
the
good
earnings,
business.
though, they're not looking good. We have adjusted loss per share at $2.20 versus an expected of $1.33. The revenue plunged 13% year over year. I had a suspicion that kids were reading less books and on TikTok more.
Yes.
Maybe underscoring that a little bit.
It's got a market cap of only $1 billion. Boy, when I covered it, it was 10 billion, 12 billion. Again, one of the few IPOs I really wanted to get that we missed. Anyway.
Yeah, larger than expected adjusted loss per share. The company spent on other areas of its business for growth. Maybe that.
I mean, you did AOL Time Warner.
That was the M&A trade. Yeah, we got.
It was a big deal.
That was
and both of those companies are also worth less now.
Yes. But their money's, their fees cleared, baby.
Yeah, the cash
Can't
cleared.
have all winners.
Yep.
Well, here's a winner though, Wayfair. This stock is up 2.3, or now only 1.3%. They got an upgrade from Bernstein, but this stock is up over 85% year to date. The furniture company.
Wait. This is just like a retailer, right? Household goods?
Furniture, like a furniture retailer.
Like it's like discount furniture that you can order online. But I was really shocked to see how
It's
strong
like a step below
this
Restoration Hardware, right?
Yes.
It's like Crate and Barrel and, I don't know,
I have a piece of furniture from Wayfair.
Elm, 5 Elm or Elmwood or
West Elm.
West Elm.
That's
there
the
you go.
fancy one. Wayfair is the.
Yeah, West Elm is the. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have that in a Short Hills Mall.
Really? I thought I think I would put West Elm and Crate and Barrel and Wayfair probably all in the same basket.
Photobombing.
And Restoration Hardware, which used to be like really a step above, they're moving down to that level, I would say. Like a lot more veneer, less solid wood.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
I'll take your word for it.
Well, Bernstein, they upgraded Wayfair to market perform from underperform, citing improving revenue growth and management's positive messaging on margins. I wonder how much longer the stock can pop, though, given the gains that it's already had this year.
Now, Ethan Allen is another one.
Yep.
But it's, I think, considered higher quality.
Is it? Okay.
And the stock is only up 14% this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
U.S. agrees to provide small number of. Oh boy, here we go. U.S. agrees to provide small number of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. I tell you, it's ramping up. What else you got for us, Emily?
Well, I'm also looking at ETF flows. We did have a number of, we had the S&P repellents, so a lot of the larger flows are a little, I guess, unclear. But if you look at 1 week, Vanguard Midcap ETF had the biggest 1 week outflow, $1.8 billion out of their Vanguard Growth ETF also saw outflows. And then if you switch it up to the 1 week inflows, SPY got $3.9 billion of inflows in just 1 week. The 1 month flow is 4.7, so I guess a lot of buyers for the equity market here.
All right, and just to put a final kind of little bow on what we've seen over the last week and a half on the IPO front, I guess the takeaways are these IPOs priced at or above their range, traded up first day, but then over succeeding days have kind of come back down to their levels, right?
Yeah.
So it's I'm not sure what to take away, and I saw the Vietnamese
Suckers.
company.
You got Syndicate, you dumped it on the suckers. That's the takeaway.
Oh yeah, but that's okay. They'll come back. I saw a Vietnamese company pull an offering, citing the market conditions.
Yeah.
So I guess the takeaway is we can get it done for you, but
it's not.
Yeah.
And maybe investors got spooked by the Fed. This
Yeah.
higher for longer message. I mean, the fact that we've seen the 2-year
That's
rise
true.
up,
I think
maybe
that's-
that kind of soured
I think
the
that's fair.
sentiment on some of these.
Of course, for the
highly
whole equity
anticipated
market. So
IPOs.
definitely also for the IPOs. I mean,
Yeah.
and to be fair, like Klaviyo is still trading above its IPO price, right? It went out at 30. It's trading at 32.85 right
that's
now.
fine. That's all right.
I thought ARM also was up above its ARM is at 50.71. It went out at 51.
Oh,
so it's
51, okay.
29 cents below its IPO price. Not a huge drop.
And the bar was already so high going
yeah.
in. So.
And I would say they're far enough from the IPO date that the underwriters don't have to support the stock here. So
let me look at
they're
CART
gonna keep their
just to round things out. The big three.
Yeah, the
CART
CART,
went out for
Instacart.
30, and it's trading at $30.07.
Okay.
So you made 7 cents.
After all of that work, to go to the rubber chicken lunch, you made 7 cents. Emily Grafeo, thank you so much for joining us. Emily Grafeo is a cross-asset reporter here. Let's talk stocks here. Let's talk med tech. Boston Scientific. I have no idea what they do, but it's a big company. It's like $80 billion in market cap. The stock's up 16%.
Don't they make medical
year-to-date.
hardware?
Medical devices, right?
Stuff.
Yeah, stuff.
Yeah.
Stuff that, so it's medical devices. Matt Hendrickson, he knows what they do. He's a senior equity analyst covering the med tech business with Bloomberg Intelligence. Boston Scientific, just give me the 30 seconds. What do they do and why do we care?
Yeah, they make stuff.
Okay.
Yeah,
like
but
stents, right? Do they make stents?
It started off with stents, and then it turned into heart valves. It turns into, and what some of the products we'll probably talk about is the Watchman device, which goes into the heart. They create catheters, and then they go into endoscopy, so single-use scopes to help with various endoscopic procedures.
All right, so
like Splunk.
Splunk,
except
right.
for people.
Yeah.
Splunk for people. Okay, now that makes sense. I get it now. During the pandemic, hospitals were overloaded with just dealing with COVID patients, so people weren't doing surgeries and procedures and things like that. And that's not good for a company like Boston Scientific or Medtronic or something like that, right?
No, they need procedural volume, especially in the cardiology side, to get their organic revenue growth, which is kind of the key driver for their valuation. All those aspects, once the hospital beds were filled with COVID patients, they couldn't do heart procedures. That's mostly in the back rearview mirror.
So now, are we back to more normalized activity?
If anything, we're kind of going still through kind of this backlog, so we're kind of getting an extra tailwind in addition to
operations, maybe.
Yeah. As opposed to revenge travel, although surely that is happening. I mean, it must be happening.
Well, for Boston, someone who can probably wait a year or two for a procedure, now they're going back to their doctor like, hey, I'm ready now.
Yep.
And the doctor's like, great, we need the volume, we need to make our money, so come on in.
All right, so Boston Scientific had an investor day. What was kind of the message they wanted to get across?
Well, the big thing was, so we talked about organic growth being kind of the driver for valuation. They were traditionally in the high single digits, so they were in 6 to 8% was kind of their long-term project or long-term outlook or goal. And so this meeting this week, they bumped it up to 8 to 10%.
Okay.
So it's and this is a company that's expected to make $14 billion in sales this year. So we're not talking about some small company making additional like $2 million to get to that growth. You're talking about a very incremental growth to kind of drive that 8 to 10% organic growth.
So what did the market respond to that?
They were up 2%, and so far this week they're still up. While the rest
So
of the
what's
market-
what's driving this growth here? I mean, is this
They also make. I mean, they do M&A, right? Didn't they just do a deal?
Yep. So they just acquired a company called Relievant, which is a procedure in your vertebrae to ablate the nerves to help with lower back pain, essentially.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds like a good thing.
But it hurts to even think about the
Back
procedure.
pain is brutal. People say back pain is just the worst. You
can't
get rid of it. All right. So what's your call on Boston Scientific?
Well, I mean, right now it's trading at about.
You can't read those numbers. The font on his page.
Do you want to use my glasses?
Of his comp page. Here, give me this thing.
It is the smallest font.
Yeah,
that I've
it's
ever
like forget
seen.
about it. You can't read that.
That's my little cheat sheet.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. But it's trading 24 times PE. It's got that for 8% growth. The call should be that investor or the analyst, the consensus should be upping their estimates, and that should be getting, normally when you say 8 to 10%, the street goes at 9%.
Yep.
Right down the middle. If you get that 9% growth, you should be able to see that multiple go up to something that's more in like the 28 times range. And so that's kind of the big call. Is they kind of during the meeting they kept saying the next level, the next level, the next level.
Right.
Well, if they're able to achieve that growth and get to closer to 10% versus the 8%, they'll get to that next level in the multiple.
By the way, I mean, who else is there? If I want a stent, I'm probably going to get it from Boston Scientific, right?
Well, I mean, yeah. Well, a stent is you're going to get is either Abbott, Medtronic, or Boston, but those are kind of the slower growing side. This is some of the key growth drivers beside the M&A is going to be the Watchman device. Now, that's a product that's going from like a $2 billion market to
what's the Watchman device?
Watchman is it's a device that closes the left atrial appendage in the heart. And essentially what it does is that appendage, for people with atrial fibrillation, holds blood in that little appendage, it clots, and then it turns into a stroke risk. They close that appendage with this device, and then therefore essentially removing the risk of blood clotting in that appendage and then going up to the brain for a stroke.
But did we not need that appendage to begin with? I mean,
that's what they found out over time is that no, they didn't. It's kind of the same thing as your appendix. It's kind of just sticking out there, and you don't need it, and you can cut it off. They were cutting it off. Now, this is a non-surgical procedure for being able to do the same thing. Yeah.
All right. So, talk to us just more broadly about the medical device business. What's the investment?
I see Boston. You mentioned a couple: Abbott, Medtronic.
Yep.
I know Stryker because I love the name, and they make hips and stuff. Edwards Life Sciences.
Yep, they're doing heart valves. Yep. So that's and everything is trying to minimize kind of the openness of surgery. So it's all minimally invasive procedures.
I like that.
So the last one was Edwards. They have taken an open heart procedure and have created a technology that you take a catheter and you don't have to open the heart. You can just go straight up through the aorta. It looks like a little like spy, like in the spy movies, those little like cameras, like those snakes around. Yeah, it's kind of just like that, and it delivers the valve, and there it's done there. But the medtech sector has been hit hard because of kind of the GLP trend that's going on.
What's the GLP trend?
The GLP drugs that are coming out for obesity, Wegovy and all those drugs. Yes.
Wegovy and Ozempic.
So I would sell a medical device company because I think there's going to be less procedures because people are going to be.
You're not going to be nearly as at risk of a heart attack or stroke if you don't weigh 300 pounds.
Yeah, but
so if you used to weigh 300 pounds and you go get an Ozempic shot once a week or I don't know, once a month, however it works.
Sometimes it's daily.
Or they're coming out with pill forms as well. So if you can take these drugs and get into better shape, you're not going to need a stent.
Really?
That's the thesis going on right now.
Wow.
But I mean, there's a lot of caveats too. There's Zimmer Biomet, for example. That's another orthopedic company like Stryker. Their CEO came out and said, hey, some of these patients who were too obese for surgery, if they take these weight loss drugs, then they'll be healthy enough to get their knee replacement or to get their hip replacement. And then the other thing too is, there's data coming out. I mean, the diabetes companies have been trying to fight back hard on this, but they're showing data that these patients who are taking these GLPs, these weight loss drugs, they're not taking them after a year. They're not taking them after 2 years. So it's, and it's something where.
But they keep the weight off?
No. So they try these.
They
drugs.
don't keep the weight off.
No, and half of these patients are just dropping out after a year, or even more.
What? So they lose weight?
They lose weight
for a year, and then they're like, "Nah, I liked being fat."
I see it as like, do you want to keep, injecting yourself with this every single day or even once a week? It's it's a lot. And
yeah, but so is being obese.
Yeah. So
I would probably rather inject myself.
Probably, but also at the same time, if you keep injecting yourself and then there is bariatric surgery as kind of that safety net there, then you're like, well,
this would be interesting to hear. I wonder if bariatric surgery is better or worse.
The belt, the loop,
the band.
Stamp.
Yeah.
In terms of losing the weight and keeping it off, I wonder which one's better longer term, Ozempic.
Well, we're going to hear more about that kind of in this third quarter call, and so that's going to be Intuitive Surgical, and that's going to be Medtronic, and it's a stay tuned type of.
Dude, what a fascinating industry to cover.
It is. It is. It's good stuff. I mean, the whole healthcare space is just. It's never going away. It's always a growth industry. You're always going to have a job if you're in the healthcare industry.
And lately I've been looking at like pictures of FDR or pictures of Walt Disney. They look like 100 years old and they died when they were 60.
Matt Hendrickson, senior equity analyst covering all the med tech space for Bloomberg Intelligence, joining us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Steve Rappaport.
Paul Ford is spared, but the United Auto Workers are moving forward with expanding strikes against GM and Stellantis. UAW President Shawn Fain.
We're doing things differently this time around. Our stand-up strike strategy is designed to do one thing: win record contracts after years of record profits. We're focused on moving the companies at the bargaining table. That means maintaining our flexibility and our leverage to escalate as we need to.
Fain, in the Facebook Live video, says the union didn't widen the strike with Ford because of progress in negotiations. Shares of Ford climbed as much as 4.6% today. Amazon says commercials are coming to its Prime Video service starting next year. More from Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel.
Amazon said the decision was aimed at aiding investment in compelling content. The company said it would also offer an ad-free option, which will cost subscribers an extra $2.99 a month in the U.S. And for those upset about the prospect of watching yet ever more commercials, Amazon did say it will aim to have meaningfully fewer ads than linear TV and other TV streaming competitors.
Thanks, Valerie. Shares of Amazon are up more than 1%. A panel of FDA advisors unanimously rejected an appeal from a Massachusetts biotech company for the agency to reconsider an implantable device designed to treat type 2 diabetes. The FDA twice denied approving the device acquired by i20 Therapeutics because of concerns that the benefits do not outweigh safety risks, particularly kidney and heart problems. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ in the green. Stocks are snapping back as bond yields retreat at the end of a jittery week that saw investors positioning for a higher-for-longer Fed stance. Oil is rebounding. Right now, we have got the S&P 500 index up 20 points, higher by 0.5%. The Dow up 45, up 0.1%. NASDAQ up 0.9%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 111 points now. 10-year yield 4.39% with a 2-year that's yielding 5.10%. Spot gold up $7 the ounce to $19.27. That is a gain of 0.4%. Bitcoin up 0.1% right now at 26,627 on Bitcoin. Goldman Sachs has agreed to pay a $6 million fine for sending inaccurate or incomplete trading data to the SEC, covering at least 163 million transactions over a decade. Goldman Sachs shares down today by 0.4%. Again, recapping, stocks are higher with the S&P up 20, a gain there of 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pelleton, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio, and we're also streaming live on YouTube. You know, I was just scrolling through some social. I saw Dan Ives. You know, he's at the Perma Bowl on Tesla, and his call is simply here. You know, what's bad for the big three is good for Tesla.
You got to believe this is good for Tesla. I mean, I was just looking at some data showing how many days supply car dealers have. So right now, the average car sits on a lot for 37 days.
Yep.
But you know, that's well off the industry average. It had been.
Kevin Tynan
it had been around 75.
Yep.
And you know, during normal years, pre-pandemic, during the worst of the pandemic, it was down to like 23 days.
Yeah.
But if this strike goes on for longer, it's going to go back down to that level.
Yep.
Which is no bueno for consumers, because when that level goes down, the price goes up.
The price goes up here. Yeah. I mean, it used to be. I mean, the days you go in a dealership, they were, you know, you're always advised to go towards the end of the month. They have to meet their quota, get their stuff off, and they'll make deals because they've got so much stuff on their lot. The days of negotiating and haggling are kind of over, I think.
Well, you're right. They were coming back. But the thing is, if there are fewer cars on the lots, you're going to be less likely to negotiate. And if there are fewer cars at the Chevy dealer, at the Ford dealer, and at the Dodge dealer, then you're going to pop over to Kia. Yep. You know, you're going to check out what's going on at Honda.
Yep.
You're more likely to look at Tesla, although I'd argue you've got to be a very specific customer to look at Tesla. It's not your cross.
You want to know how I just bought my BMW X3 last week? I walked into the showroom, pointed to it, I want it. Now, I said, I'll take that one. I don't care. They're all the same. And then I walked out, and guess what? I didn't even pay for it.
Right. Well, I've noticed that recently as well.
They tracked me down yesterday. We're sorry, we didn't get your payment, you know, your down payment on this thing. They just let me walk out the door with this thing.
Last time I bought a car, after like 2 weeks, I kept thinking I haven't paid for anything. So I called the dealer and I said, dude, I feel like kind of an idiot here, but do I have to pay? And he was like, yeah, we'll mail you something. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's weird, because usually that's, I mean, you go to the salesperson, into the business person, that's the first thing. Can I see your credit card? Do you have a, check or something like that? All right, let's look at the M&A front here. We're got a big M&A trade. Looks like it actually might close. Microsoft, Activision, $69 billion. We got some approval, I think, from the UK's regulatory body. That was kind of the last one to fall. Jennifer Reed joins us. She's a senior litigation analyst. She focuses on antitrust. It's just right down her alley. She does that all for Bloomberg Intelligence. So, Jen, what did the UK authorities rule here on this Microsoft Activision deal?
Well, Paul, at long last, it finally looks like this deal is going to close. What they have said is that a new remedy that Microsoft proposed about a month ago or so is probably sufficient to cure the concerns they had about the deal, that it looks likely that it's sufficient. This is a provisional decision. And so what they will do now is listen to comments by interested public, other entities that participate in the market, and then at some point after October 6th, issue a final ruling. But really, Paul, this is called provisional, but this is it. I mean, they're going to ultimately clear this deal. There's no doubt in my mind.
The weird thing to me was, if you're going to do a big M&A transaction, I get that you need to have the U.S. regulators approve it.
Right.
And I get, because it's a massive market, I get that you're going to have Europe approve it. But England? Do they really matter that much anymore?
Well, I guess they do now. They've made a big splash in the antitrust world. You know, the UK used to be part of the European Union before Brexit. So it didn't really issue its own opinions with respect to these big global mergers that were big enough to trigger European Commission review. You know, there might have been other deals that actually did trigger just only UK review in which the UK was still involved. But for the most part, when you had these big acquisitions like Microsoft Activision, you didn't have the UK independently involved. And now they are. And I think they really want to flex their muscles. They want to show that they are a real antitrust regulator.
I mean, I'm obviously that would comment as tongue in cheek. So if you're British and you're offended, please don't email my boss. They do have 67 million people, but again, it's only 67 million people in the UK. What other regulators do I have to worry about? Am I going to the Indonesian regulator? They have a lot of people. What about India? Do they look at the M&A deal? You know what? People don't know this, but I'll tell you what. When these deals get filed, sometimes they're filed with over 100 jurisdictions. They could be filed in Azerbaijan. There are so many jurisdictions with competition authorities. So, you know, there's a whole group within these law firms that have to assess every single jurisdiction globally where a deal has to get filed, where it might trigger the thresholds for that country or that jurisdiction. But in reality, the jurisdictions that really have the law behind them, and I think the will to actually block a deal, are primarily the U.S., EU, China, and now UK.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, I saw some reporting, Jen, which kind of goes to what you said to the way you were talking about the UK. And the UK says, hey, you know, we're going to kind of prove this one here, but you better be careful what you bring to us, because we're not going to be a pushover here. So I guess that if you're an antitrust M&A lawyer, you got to keep that into account these days.
You know, absolutely. I think it's getting harder and harder. I mean, just the fact that the FTC and DOJ are changing a lot of rules, making it more onerous actually to notify the deal to the regulators, more expensive as well, and have these extended review timelines and have become very unpredictable. Now you have to deal also with this unpredictable CMA in the UK. And I think that it just adds to the uncertainty of deals. It makes it harder and harder for the merger arbitrageurs to actually, you know, do what they do. And I think, you know, what I'm thinking about right now is the Adobe Figma deal, because I wonder what the UK is going to do on that one. It's moved into a phase 2 on it, and I could see the UK actually being one of those regulators that tries to block that deal.
Hey, Jen, I mean, on the banking side, we usually charged a percentage of the deal size as our fee, and that got negotiated up front, that percentage. How does it work on the legal side? Is it still all about hours, billable hours? So, I mean, a case like this, with all the antitrust, must have been just a juicy deal for the lawyers.
Oh, yeah. It's all about hours. And I'll tell you, the attorneys log some serious hours. When these jurisdictions go into those in-depth investigations, they are rigorous. They take a lot of work. I mean, that's what I spent most of my legal practice doing, was responding to these second requests from the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. And they ask for a lot of data, a lot of information, a lot of responses to questions. There are depositions. There are interviews of company executives. It takes a lot of time. And when it's so protracted, like Microsoft Activision, with appeals and going to court, it is expensive. Those lawyers did very well.
By the way, on that note, and kind of an aside, but do you round up to the nearest hour? I mean, if you're driving home to Westchester and you're a lawyer for one of these cases and somebody calls you from the company to talk about it, and it's like a 5-minute conversation, is that one billable hour?
No. Now, I will say that every law firm has different rules about what becomes a billable hour and what doesn't become a billable hour. I can only vouch for the firm I work for, which was very careful about these things, and a 5-minute call would not have been a billable hour. But if those 5-minute calls start to add up, maybe you have a billable hour there. And it also sometimes depends on how much the legal counsel within the company push back on those bills, because they do and they can, and
See, in my experience, it's been quarter hours. You get billed for like a 5-minute phone call. You get billed a quarter hour.
Right. Well, that makes more
With
sense.
Some law firms, yeah.
And Jen, how about the senior partner? This devolved away from Michigan. I mean, Microsoft to just kind of how they make money. So the senior partners at these white shoe New York law firms, do they still have to bill hours, or do they just take a salary?
Oh, no, they bill hours. Everybody bills hours. They bill hours and it goes to the client. I mean, look, I haven't been practicing law now for about 8 years, but as far as I know, things haven't changed. And the senior partners have to keep the calendar just the same way the associates do and log all their time, bill their hours.
That is just no way to live a life, right?
Yeah, I feel like the bankers may have it figured out, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I don't know. The lawyers do just fine as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
All right, Jen, thanks so much for joining us, giving us a
Thank
little
you.
primer on how you earn your money in the law firm. So you bill hours, I guess. Jennifer Rhee, Senior Litigation Analyst, covering the antitrust.
What do you think an hour
angle.
costs at one of the top white shoe law firms?
Oh, boy. I don't know, $500 an hour, $1,000 an hour?
Definitely over 1,000.
Over 1,000, wow.
I think.
All right. I mean, I don't know if I would break down my deal fee into hours. I wonder how that would look. All right, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. UAW President Shawn Fain is reporting progress in contract talks with Ford, but he says GM and Stellantis are another story. So he's announced an expansion of the union strike, which will now include all parts distribution centers for those two automakers.
We will shut down parts distribution until those two companies come to their senses and come to the table with a serious offer.
Fain says the strike now expands to 20 states. The union is seeking pay raises of 36% over 4 years, an end to lower pay scales for new workers, and a 32-hour work week for 40 hours of pay. The car companies say they cannot afford the union's demands despite huge profits because they need to invest in the transformation to electric vehicles. Well, there is no progress to report in efforts to avoid a government shutdown. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has sent House lawmakers home for a 3-day weekend, with a shutdown looking likely in little more than a week.
Divisions within the GOP have party lawmakers struggling to agree on how much to cut spending and unable to come up with a set list of demands from Democrats. Republican infighting torpedoed plans for a Saturday House vote on a temporary spending bill that would have at least served as a starting point in negotiations with the Senate. Bloomberg Economics estimates a month-long government shutdown could temporarily push up the unemployment rate to 4% in October. In Washington, I'm Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez is facing a federal indictment for the second time in a decade. The Justice Department says the Democrat and his wife have been indicted on bribery charges. The indictment is connected to their relationship with 3 New Jersey businessmen. Prosecutors say they found $100,000 worth of gold bars and nearly $500,000 in cash at the Menendez home. Menendez says he's being falsely accused. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Sources tell Bloomberg the Federal Trade Commission is expected to sue Amazon for antitrust violations next week, marking the agency's fourth swipe at the online retail giant this year. Amazon shares up now by 1.3%. It is an update for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. Bond yields are retreating at the end of a jittery week that saw investors positioning for a higher-for-longer Fed stance. The S&P is up 23, a gain now of 0.5%. The Dow up 72, up 0.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 120 points, up 0.9%. 10-year yield 4.43% with a 2-year 5.10%. Spot gold up $6.50 the ounce to $19.26, up 0.3%. Crude lower now, down 16 cents a barrel, 89.48, a drop there of just about 0.2%. So what about the economic backdrop, specifically those recession calls? David Rosenberg is the president and founder of Rosenberg Research, and he was a guest this morning right here on Bloomberg Markets.
The soft landing is here, but it's the transition to the inevitable recession, because recessions are inherently part of the business cycle, unless you think the business cycle has been repealed, and I don't.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. As we have been reporting, GM and Stellantis face walkouts of 38 more facilities as talks with their workers' union failed to make headway. Ford was spared the escalation after making progress in the negotiations. Our Nancy Lyons will have more on the story coming up in a moment. Ford shares up 2.5%, GM down 0.1%, Stellantis up 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pell, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Matt Miller and Paul Sweeney live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. You know, this feels like the first major war where drone technology is being deployed here, and it just seems like we're in the early innings of how this might evolve here. So we want to talk to somebody who's kind of really focused on this part of the engagement there. Veronica Mudra, CEO, and the company's name is Alter Ego. Veronica joins us via Zoom. Veronica, thanks so much for joining us here. Can you tell us what Alter Ego is and kind of what's the focus of you and your company?
Hello, thank you for having me today. I'm the CEO of Alter Ego, which is women-owned, Ukrainian-owned, US-based company that mostly does the cybersecurity services, and also we represent special military technologies, including specific UAS and counter-UAS technologies and VTOLs solutions that we can discuss today.
What is? Did you say UAS, or we don't know all the acronyms? So what are that?
Okay. It's technically drones. It's unmanned aircraft system. And when then the counter UAS, it's technically the technologies to protect yourself from the drones attacks. That's CUAS, and then I also mentioned VTOLs. That's the
vertical takeoff and landing.
Exactly. Okay, here we go.
So, Veronica, from your perspective and based upon your knowledge, how are drones being used in this conflict?
So we actually have a little analysis of what worked, what did not work during this current war in Ukraine in terms of drones. So I can just go, if I may, I can just go into that subject a little bit more. So let's say what did not work. So the pure ISR UAVs, they sustain the highest value of losses provided in this war. Then the stand-up operations of the theater level CUAVs is ineffective. Then the And I'm sorry to say that, but one of the biggest letdowns was the U.S. military UAVs and LMSs. What I mean by that is AV's RQ-20 Puma was the most notorious failure. So what really worked was cheaper and semi-disposable mass-produced UAVs. So smaller drones are more effective currently than CRP, no steering GNSS, anti-jammers. They're very effective. Then, of course, asymmetric warfare. We hear a lot about the hybrid war, but this specific war is quite asymmetric. Then what really worked is the high resolution HD or higher EO or IR Jim belt payloads. Then the really GNSS chirp jammers. So I do think that the jammers, that's the thing in this war, right? Yep. So when we see Russian drones coming, and they are actually, sorry to say, but they include jammers that you can buy on AliExpress for $500, right? So, and that's true. I'm sorry to say, but that's true. And they instantly have a satellite position and denial within a 10-kilometer radius. So basically, the drones that we think, in our opinion, are really strong ones, the ones that are produced in Cyprus called Poseidons, they designed to work in this kind of environments, rapidly changing, very dynamic environments that currently we can observe in the Ukraine.
Is this? But Veronica, is this technology evolving? Because it feels like we're in the very early stages of using drones in warfare. So, I mean, I guess are you finding that the Ukrainians and maybe even the Russians are learning as they go and changing tactics?
Absolutely, 100%, 110%. So the lessons, what we're learning from the war in Ukraine, that it's a hybrid asymmetric warfare, highly dynamic environment, meaning that the technologies are battlefield born, and obviously you need to find a countermeasures so fast. So when we opened this company, we handpicked technologies like the Poseidon's drones that are produced in Cyprus, for example, but they're very effective now in Ukraine. They have up to 4 or 5 updates per year. So can you imagine to update the whole production 4 to 5 days per year? This is crazy, right? So they have to find fast responses and fast solutions to the technologies, to the Russian drones, Iranian drones, with new Chinese parts that come in to Ukraine constantly. So we all know how drastic attacks from Iranian Shahid drones in Ukraine. So in these situations, Ukrainians coming up so fast with different technologies, with 3D printed drones, with amazing counter drones, domes that are non-expensive, and they're can be scaled up to mass production as well. So I mean, we have a lot of lessons to learn for sure.
All right, Veronica, thanks so much for taking the time. We appreciate learning about this little part of this terrible conflict in Ukraine. Veronica Mudra, CEO of Alter Ego, talking about the, I guess, drones being used. And it just feels like the whole, both sides and probably everybody else that's in the military is kind of trying to figure out how to use these things and tactics.
I mean,
and so on.
I'd say I'd love to get Veronica on again and talk about the other work that she does, because she founded the White Ribbon campaign in the U.S. and Ukraine, and they defend against or fight back against gender-based violence, and she seems to do a lot of work in that sector. So, the UAVs and the VOTLs and the TRSs and I can't make hide nor hair of that. So, but I would love to hear about what's actually like on the ground for the people in this conflict right now.
Yeah, it's got to be terrible, and it's we'll have to see. Hopefully, tide will turn there. S&P 500 up 0.5% this morning. The Nasdaq up 0.9%. Yields 10-year Treasury 4.43%. We're going to have more coming up in just moments. This is Bloomberg. Did some company news right now. Steve Rappaport.
Paul, the United Auto Workers widened their strike against General Motors and Stellantis. UAW President Shawn Fain.
We can and will go all out if our national leadership decides the companies aren't willing to move. Right now, we think we can get there. Stellantis and GM in particular are going to need some serious pushing. Obviously, going on strike isn't something we take lightly, and it's not something we do without a clear strategy to win.
Fain, in a Facebook Live video, says the expansion will not target Ford because of progress in contract negotiations. American Airlines is the latest carrier to discover improperly certified replacement parts on its aircraft. Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger reports.
Steve, American Airlines disclosed the finding to Bloomberg News last night after federal regulators issued warnings to carriers and other aviation companies about the problem. American did not identify the parts in question. The FAA says the suspect components were sold with allegedly forged airworthiness documents by London-based AOG Technics. Discovery of the parts, first in Europe, triggered a worldwide search. As many as 96 engines made by CFM International were fitted with the components. CFM makes engines for many older General Airbus and Boeing aircraft. Steve?
Thanks, Jeff. Microsoft and Activision Blizzard appear to be closing in on clearing the last hurdle for their $69 billion merger. The UK's antitrust regulator signaled it will approve the plan based on new concessions offered by Microsoft. Shares of both companies are up. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, looking at these markets here, up about 0.5% on the S&P 500, not too bad. NASDAQ doing a little bit better here, up 0.9%, so we are at or near the intraday highs. On the yield space 10-year Treasury, 4.43%. That's off about 6 basis points. And we're going to keep an eye on oil as we've been doing over the last few months. Just right about $90 a barrel here, so pretty flat for WTI crude oil, but it's had a big move, so we stay on top of that. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C., and we'll get world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. There is progress being reported in talks between Ford and its auto workers. But UAW President Shawn Fain says it's quite different with GM and Stellantis, so he's calling on union members to expand their strike.
All of the parts distribution facilities at General Motors and Stellantis are being called to stand up and strike. We will be striking 38 locations across 20 states, across all 9 regions of the UAW.
Fain says the union is still pushing for pay raises closer to 36% over 4 years and an end to tiered wages. The automakers say despite strong profits, they cannot afford to meet the union's demands. Senator Robert Menendez has been indicted by federal prosecutors.
The Democratic senator from New Jersey was indicted by federal prosecutors over allegations that he took hundreds of thousands in bribes from 3 local businessmen to protect their interests and help the Egyptian government. The indictment in federal court in New York alleges that Menendez and his wife engaged in a corruption relationship with the 3 New Jersey associates and businessmen from at least 2018 up until about 2022. The government said that the couple accepted bribes, including cash, gold bars, and payments toward a mortgage and luxury vehicle. In New York, Michael Barr, Bloomberg Radio.
Menendez says prosecutors have misrepresented the normal work of a congressional office. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is at the cusp of a historic breakthrough with Saudi Arabia. He told the United Nations General Assembly today he expects a peace agreement soon between the 2 nations.
Such a peace will go a long way to ending the Arab-Israeli conflict. It will encourage other Arab states to normalize their relations with Israel.
Netanyahu says such an agreement would truly create a new Middle East. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Paul and Matt.
All right, Nancy Lyons, thank you so much. We appreciate that. You know, there's an M&A deal out there that is just fascinating to me, and that is U.S. Steel. First of all, I didn't even know U.S. Steel was still kind of like in existence.
Great ticker.
X is the ticker. Now, but apparently it is, and it's been the subject of some deal interest.
It's not as big as it once was, right? It's a $7 billion business right now.
Yeah, I think it's been kind of pieced out. But Canadian steelmaker Stelco Holdings is pursuing a bid for bigger rival and former owner United States Steel, adding to a growing list of suitors for the iconic American company. Stelco, whose sales and market value are dwarfed by U.S. Steel's, seeks to buy the Pittsburgh-based producer to increase its steelmaking assets and boost its share of the market for supplying metal to the automotive industry. So U.S. Steel shipped 6 times more steel than Stelco last year and has a market value almost 5 times larger than the Canadian firm it once owned here. So I'm not sure how this is going to work, but U.S. Steel rose as much as 1.9% on Friday in New York, while Stelco rose as much as 1% in Toronto. So there's still a lot of interest in this because I think U.S. Steel, they announced a strategic review in August after they rejected a $7.25 billion bid from rival Cleveland Cliffs. So I guess U.S. Steel continues to be in play here.
Yeah, I think so too. But we don't see a lot of movement in the share price.
No.
Right now it's trading at $31.86. This is a company that was worth a heck of a lot more back in the day, right? I mean, it used to trade for $200 a share. So I wonder if it has been pieced out to the point where it's just too boring to pay attention to.
And then in The Godfather 2, the great line talking about the mafia, referring to the mafia, when Hyman Roth said to Michael, "We're bigger than U.S. Steel."
Well, when I think of steel in movies, I always think of Anacott Steel loves Blue Horseshoe.
Yes, Blue Horseshoe loves Anacott Steel. All right, check out that reference on YouTube. This is Bloomberg. Sound on. Joe Matthew, next.
from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
We're talking about red and blue division within states. How busy is Donald Trump's legal team going to be? It's the economy, stupid. Is that actually what will decide this race?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
Federal spending combined with too lax monetary policy has produced this 40-year high in inflation.
China policy is driven basically by domestic politics.
American families are finding themselves further behind the eight ball.
To get anything done in this Congress, it's going to have to be done in a bipartisan way.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
So, hey, where'd everyone go? Welcome to the fastest show in politics as lawmakers head home for an extra long weekend with no plan to fund the government past next week. We'll talk about the difficult path ahead and whether a shutdown is inevitable coming up with Bill Hoagland from the Bipartisan Policy Center. He's with us at the table in just a moment. The United Auto Workers, meantime, expanding strikes, as you've been hearing on Bloomberg, against GM and Stellantis, but not Ford. We'll take a look at why and explore how it's playing on the campaign trail. Political shades here that we'll be hearing about from Bloomberg Politics reporter Mark Niket. More on these stories, plus a new poll in New Hampshire that might make President Biden feel a bit better today with our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us for the hour, and we start, as always, with a look at Wall Street. Let's get to trading with Charlie Pellet. Charlie?
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. You mentioned the automakers. Let's begin there. Ford up 2.5%. We've got GM down 0.3%, while Stellantis is higher now by 0.4%. So the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all continue to move higher. Stocks snapping back as bond yields retreat at the end of a jittery week that saw investors positioning for a higher for longer Federal Reserve stance. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.42% right now, and the 2-year on this Friday, 5.10%. S&P at 43.50 now, up 20 points, a gain of 0.5%. The Dow's up 46 points, up by 0.1%, and the NASDAQ Composite Index up now by 0.8%. Spot gold up $4.93 the ounce to $19.23, and that is a gain of 0.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.5%, 90.05 right now for a barrel of WTI. Peter Cheer is the head of macro strategy at Academy Securities, and he says, when it comes to markets, you got to look broader than a potential government shutdown.
If the shutdown lasts months or something, maybe it's a problem. If we get it in a week, I don't see a big deal. I think the auto work strike is potentially a risk. Again, that will take time to see how it plays out. When I'm sitting here trying to look at the world, and what I want to figure out over the weekend and the coming weeks is, we're going to see some AI success stories. I really want to figure out, are companies going to be able to start demonstrating, hey, we've used AI and we've seen these great efficiencies? Because I think that would be much more important to the market than anything that's going on with either the government or right now even the auto strike.
And, of course, more on the auto strike coming up right here on Sound On, as well as on a potential government shutdown. And, by the way, you can hear more of the conversation with Peter Cheer on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you, and welcome to the Friday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where lawmakers have left us all to ourselves. They're gone for the long weekend without crafting a plan on the budget, and we're going to get to that. More immediately here, news from the UAW that you've been hearing about for the last couple of hours on Bloomberg. Remember, we had a 12 noon Eastern, high noon deadline, and you better believe the UAW is scaling up strikes, but not all of them, targeting GM and Stellantis, not Ford. We heard from Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, just before the deadline.
Today, at noon Eastern Time, all of the parts distribution facilities at General Motors and Stellantis are being called to stand up and strike. We will be striking 38 locations across 20 states, across all 9 regions of the UAW.
But as I mentioned, not Ford. And as we look ahead to the next week here, in hopes of some sort of a breakthrough, there's going to be an added political element to this as Donald Trump goes to Detroit instead of the Republican debate to speak to members. And this is happening amid calls for President Biden to do the same. He's actually out with a new ad today on all of this. I call it an ad. It's an online video that he just posted on Twitter using the words, of Republicans in this case to describe his stand on the union. Give this a taste.
When you have a president that's constantly saying, go union, this is what you get. The unions get emboldened
That's
and then
Nikki
they start
Haley
asking
here.
for things.
The first bill he passed had $86 billion for unions.
Senator Tim Scott now.
This president clearly does prioritize union jobs, and he's made very clear here.
And you've got an anchor here at Fox Business News.
That they're paying.
So you get a taste of this. By the way, he said yes is the one word on the tweet. Mark Niquette is with us, Bloomberg politics and government reporter. Mark, it's wonderful to have you in Washington as we consider the political side to this important, business meets Wall Street kind of story. We add Washington as well, and it's hard to escape the politics as Republicans try to seize the moment. Can they do that? Is Donald Trump onto something next week?
We're going to find out. I mean, it's pretty clear that what President Trump's trying to do is to cut into Biden's union support in Michigan, key swing state in the 2024 election. Biden did very well, beat Trump by about 150,000 votes in 2020. So in addition to counter-programming the GOP debate that's going on in California, I think Trump is sensing an opportunity here that he could make some headway with union members in particular.
It's a pretty friendly crowd, though, right? The rank and file was already kind of leaning toward Republicans and Trump in the last couple of elections here. Is Joe Biden the one who has to win over their support?
Well, there's certainly a disconnect between the union leadership that has historically backed Democrats and the rank and file members. The Democrats would have you believe that it's a majority of the rank and file still support Biden and the Democrats, and sure, there is support on the rank and file for Republicans, but I think that the big question is, does Trump really have the ability to move many of the folks, the union folks who voted for Biden in 2020 and 2024?
You're going to be at this speech, I guess we'll call it, next week in Detroit. He's not expected on the picket line, from what we understand, because of security concerns. Will he be in a union hall, or what? Do we have logistics yet?
Yeah, we're not entirely sure, other than it's a primetime speech with current and former union members, and including not just UAW members, but pipe fitters and other union folks.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the messages from Fain today was, this is not just the big three. This is about more than the big three. And he went through a litany of labor actions in his, I guess, Facebook Live conversation, his live message to members here. This is bigger than the UAW. We just went through UPS. We had rail workers earlier in the year. Is that why Republicans think they have something?
I think so. That and the overwhelming dissatisfaction that voters say they have with the economy and Biden's handling of the economy. Survey after survey shows that he's just not making any headway with his message of Bidenomics, connecting with people.
Yeah.
And one of the things we're watching to see, I think, is if Biden engages now with this strike in a more personal way. The Facebook video from Fain you mentioned, more or less invited Biden to show up at the picket line.
But he denounced Trump's visit, didn't he?
He did. And before, the message was, we don't want presidential politics involved in this negotiation. We can do fine without it, thank you.
Yeah.
But there seems to have been a change now where Fain is welcoming Biden to intervene in the strike. So I guess it'll be interesting if we have a sort of a split screen with both Biden and Trump showing up in Michigan to try and make some headway with the strike.
That would be a moment in this campaign. To intervene, though, did you mean to use that word in terms of maybe mediate?
No, not mediate, but intervene in the sense of inserting themselves into the big picture. If not the negotiations directly.
That could still happen, of course. Mark, you're also writing about the impact this may have on the Ohio Senate race. What should we be watching?
Well, we're watching to see what impact this has on Sherrod Brown. He has a tough reelection in Ohio, and historically he's relied on the vote of, in particular, the UAW to carry Ohio. But Ohio has been moving much more to the right in recent elections. A lot of these union folks who forever were Democrats clearly voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020. The big question is, can Sherrod Brown hold these folks, these union voters in particular? If they went for Trump, will they still support Sherrod Brown? So I think the union is looking to Sherrod to be visibly on their side and help if he can in any way, deliver the gains they're looking for in these negotiations.
We've got a lot to learn here still. It's like every time you turn around, there's another layer on these races, and this UAW is a pretty big layer. Would you join us from Detroit while you're out there next week? I'd love to hear from you. Mark, it's great to have you in Washington. Mark Niquette, Bloomberg Politics government reporter. Many thanks for talking with us, as always, on Sound On. It's not all that often we get an in-person review from Mark Niquette. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we prepare to bring in Bill Hoagland now from the Bipartisan Policy Center. We'll bring you up to date on what's happening on Capitol Hill, and by that I mean nothing. They're all gone. Well, I shouldn't say all gone. There's actually a Rules Committee hearing that's taking place that will likely feed into this whole conversation as the House tries to get some single-issue spending bills to the floor next week. But everybody else is out of here. Couldn't get a defense spending bill to even reach debate on the floor of the House. The House and Senate don't see eye to eye. Republicans themselves in the House still do not see eye to eye. And listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene. She posted a video in the gym. She's putting up the gym videos always with the pull-ups, and I guess she had just worked out and she's frustrated.
I'm particularly frustrated today. We went home for August recess. We should have stayed in Washington working to get our appropriation bills done, but we didn't. We went on August recess, and that's when we're supposed to go back to our districts and get work done in our districts. That's what we did. But we should have stayed in Washington and funded the government and gotten all the work done, hammering out the details.
Doesn't sound like she's terribly happy with her ally, Kevin McCarthy, on all of this. Let's turn to Bill Hoagland, as I mentioned, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center, spent more than a day in the Senate working for Bill Frist as the Director of Budget and Appropriations. I won't go through your whole resume, Bill, but it's wonderful to see you here, and thank you for coming. Boy, I remember the conversations we had around the debt limit, the potential default. We thought we had a deal. We're really learning now, apparently we did not. And as everybody heads home, we're going to have, 4 or 5 days potentially to figure this entire thing out next week. You've got some folks described as legislative arsonists who are calling for a shutdown. Speaker McCarthy says he doesn't understand this mentality of just burn the place down. Is that what's happening? Is this caucus going to burn down the House?
Well, they're working on it pretty hard, I think, in terms of causing some real problems for the speaker. But I remain somewhat optimistic that we're going to be able to work this thing out. If nothing else, focus on the United States Senate next week. The United States Senate on Tuesday will be taking up a piece of legislation called the FAA Reauthorization Bill. And not to get into the weeds about this, but it allows them to call that bill up and strip it because it's a revenue bill, because there's revenues in that bill. Allow them to strip out the FAA portion and put in a continuing resolution and then send it over to the House. And so it'll be in the House's job to take up that particular resolution.
Right. So this has been, people are talking about the Senate jamming the House. This would be the Senate doing its job.
Yes.
Maybe swooping in at the last minute, but we hear that Kevin McCarthy gets fired if he tries to pass that.
Well, I'm not exactly sure that's going to happen. I mean, he may face a motion to vacate his speakership. I think that's true. But in the last 24, 48 hours, I have been at least hearing that, listen, what's the alternative? And so Democrat, the way the House works, and I'm a Senate staffer, not a House staffer, so I can't always speak to the procedures in the House. Yeah. But the House Democrats could basically not show up to vote on that vacate the position, or they could vote present, and in which case then the Speaker would survive a motion to vacate the office.
So when I ask Democrats here, would you come to the Speaker's defense, and they laugh at me, that's actually what they mean. They would come to his defense without voting for him, just by lowering the threshold.
That's exactly right. So I think that's I think from the beginning, this has always been a question as to whether or not the Speaker wanted to keep government operational, or did he threaten his own position as a Speaker? And I think this is where it's going to come down to.
Do we in that world end up having like a weekend shutdown or something? Or
well, the good news, of course, is not the good news. The news is that, of course, the fiscal year begins on a Sunday.
That's right.
So it is possible that we would have a shutdown on Sunday, maybe Monday if they're. But I personally, I think that first of all, nobody, Joe, nobody wins in these situations. If people say, well, it's outside the beltway. We may hear inside the beltway say we know where the problem is. It's in the House. But outside the beltway, nobody understands. Basically, everybody, we all look bad. And so I think the sooner we get to the position of passing a continuing resolution, the better. Listen, we're not out of the woods here. Even if they do pass a continuing resolution, it'll probably be to the end of October.
Yes,
maybe to think, we'll be going through this again. We're pushing up against snowflakes in December, I think, before we get everything resolved.
Wow. And that's exactly what Kevin McCarthy said he didn't want, right? Don't jam me up against the holidays. He said, let's get it done before then. But then there's reality.
That would be nice, but I don't think that's going to happen.
But you also don't think he's going to get fired, which means he might have a little bit more wiggle room than people are illustrating in the media.
I think he's going to try his best to go as far as he can, to push it as far as he can up until he has to. And I think I honestly think he understands. To do this, he has to have Democratic support. And this would be, listen, it's 2 against 1. The White House and the Senate, it's 2 against 1. And I've never been in a knife fight, but if it was 2 against 1, I think I'd put my bets on the 2.
Yeah, that's right. Fair enough, even without a knife. So Mitch McConnell wants to see Ukraine funding. President Zelensky was here yesterday. He made the case. Would that CR include it?
Well, that's a good question. As I understand that probably would there be an attempt to put Ukraine funding in this bill that I'm talking about coming from the Senate. Rand Paul has indicated that he is opposed to that, and so that may delay that's why that may delay getting the bill out of the Senate and over to the House. But at the end of the day, I think there probably will remain. They may want to delay this Ukraine funding until the end of the October to the next round they go through it. But I think at some point here, the Senate is pretty well, majority minority is pretty well in agreement. Besides those few,
that's right.
It's the House that's going to be the problem with the Ukraine funding.
It's been a recurring theme. In our last moment, I just wonder your reflections here when it comes to the dysfunction. Even if we get through this, to your point, we might have another shutdown at the end of the year, and we're going to be wrangling over this for the balance, it seems, of this Congress, aren't we?
Oh, I think so. I think when you have this narrow of a margin in the House, you're going to have and we move into this political season in a bigger way. It's going to continue on right up into the election time next year. I think this is going to continue on this division. I'm sad about that. I think it's not the way the government should operate. Of course, I go back to maybe a different time and place on Capitol Hill where we had differences, but we worked out those differences and put the country's best before us.
Well, it's because of your experience in that time and place that we enjoy talking with you, because that's the perspective we need now. Bill Hoagland, the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thanks as always for the insights. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 index is rising from nearly oversold levels. The NASDAQ 100 index is outperforming right now. It is up by just about 0.7%. To put that in context, the S&P now higher by 0.3%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 0.5%. A little change right now on the Dow, up just 12 points, remaining in the green. S&P as we head into the weekend at 43.42. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.42%, with the 2-year right now 5.10%. Gold up $6 the ounce, up 0.3% to $19.26 the ounce on spot gold, while West Texas Intermediate crude right around the $90 barrel level, 90.04 right now on WTI, up by 0.5%. Brent, the global benchmark, 93.37, up by about 0.1%. Federal Trade Commission is expected to sue Amazon for antitrust violations next week, according to people familiar with the matter, marking the agency's fourth swipe at the online retail giant this year. Amazon shares today, they are trading higher. Amazon up now by about 0.5%. Recapping, after a rough week for the U.S. stock market, an up Friday, S&P up 11 points right now, higher by 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Maybe it's a good thing that everyone has left town. Maybe that allows the leadership to work on a deal. Maybe that's wishful thinking. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Welcome to Sound On, the Friday edition, as we look ahead to a long weekend for lawmakers, maybe not you, and a very difficult path ahead for potentially funding the government. We assemble our panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors, as Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, laments those in his own Republican conference who he says want to torch the place. This is the Speaker coming out of a failed vote yesterday to try to begin debate on a defense spending bill.
I don't understand why anybody votes against bringing the idea and having the debate. And then you got all the amendments if you don't like the bill. This is a whole new concept of individuals that just want to burn the whole place down. It doesn't work.
Rick Davis, the Speaker is perplexed. Is he out of control?
Is the Speaker out of control, or is the caucus out of control? I think the Speaker is angry because the caucus is not keeping its deals intact. So I don't blame him. I think this is really outrageous that you have veterans voting against the consideration of the defense appropriations bill. I mean, I've never seen anything like this either in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And it's put the Speaker in a really tight spot. Now they have no idea what to bring up next week. The defense authorization, DHS, agriculture. I mean, he's got to figure out what he's going to do. But I was so glad you had Bill Hoagland on, because he really has the scoop, which is, the Senate's going to hollow out this revenue bill. Only way you can vote on a CR is through a revenue bill, and the only way to do it is the House has to start it. So the House sends them, the FAA reauthorization, and they turn it into the CR. So you're going to have a CR potentially on the floor in the House next week, and one that Democrats will vote on. So the question then is, will McCarthy actually take a vote on that bill? I mean, so the caucus doesn't want to vote on defense, and is McCarthy going to want to vote on a bipartisan CR? It's just going to be really fascinating.
And of course, if the votes on a bipartisan CR, which we're now expecting to come from the Senate, Jeannie, guys like Matt Gaetz are promising a motion to vacate, and they think they can get him fired. The other fear, by the way, if you ask Matt Gaetz, at least, who does not want any part of a stopgap solution here, and I think is girding for a shutdown or encouraging a shutdown, is this discharge petition, the idea that there be a workaround to bring this to the floor by House members. And we actually bleep what he said on the Tim cast about this last evening. Listen to what's worrying Matt Gaetz of Florida.
What the threat is that 5
liberal or moderate Republicans could just say, we don't want to do the single subject bills. We don't want to go through the pain of doing the cuts to foreign aid or to food stamps or anything like that. So we're just going to go sign what's called a discharge petition and then just move that thing like through a goose.
Like S through a goose, he says, on a microphone in front of a camera, Jeannie. I'm really starting to think it's time to just remake Schoolhouse Rock here. I've been learning more about the legislative process these past couple weeks than I ever imagined. How about you?
Oh, yeah. And I've never heard that S through the goose either. So I'm learning all kinds of things. I haven't either. Thank you, Joe. And, it's interesting to listen to Matt Gaetz bemoan the fact that a few lone representatives, maybe as few as 4 or 5, as he says, might hold up the process of regular order. I mean, it is just fascinating to listen to the hypocrisy come from Matt Gaetz. And the reality is, if they wanted to engage in consideration of these bills, they couldn't wait till 8-9 days before the government shuts down to do that and oppose even a continuing resolution so you could keep the government open and then have these sort of, considerations and sort of something akin to normal order. And I think my biggest fear, because we're listening to Matt Gaetz, so I'm going to add mine. My biggest fear is that we are playing by old rules. We are playing by pre-Trump rules. And I think one thing Democrats have to consider is that whereas these shutdowns have traditionally hurt Republicans, and I think they will continue to, Donald Trump has been pushing for chaos everywhere he can find it. In the House is another place, in Congress. He wants this shutdown because he wants to make the case that under Joe Biden, who he describes as incompetent, the government has resulted in chaos, whether it's the southern border, smash and grabs, crime, and in terms of basic governance like budgeting. So I am really concerned, and I think Democrats should be as well, that this does not just hurt Republicans, but it ends up hurting the Biden administration, the Biden campaign, just as Donald Trump has been pushing for and intended to. And that is new stakes in this game that they're playing.
Rick, I know you're not a big fan of Matt Gaetz. I'll let you speak to that if you want to. But is there an element of what he is saying that actually rings true when it comes to regular order? When he talks about single issue spending bills, does he feel burned by Kevin McCarthy, who promised regular order, or is this just bad behavior? Sign the CR and keep the government open.
Well, I mean, he's been on the group who have been voting against appropriations bills, which are being brought up in regular order after committees have approved them. And so it is a bit hypocritical that he would then claim that anybody else who would actually try to skirt his influence, by using a different legislative rule. I mean, that's just selfish, right? I mean, of course, if he's going to be along with 5 other Freedom Caucus members obstructing regular order, then people are going to look for other avenues to get their legislation passed.
Do you think Bill Hoagland is right in that Democrats might turn away or not show up for a vote if there was a motion to vacate to, kind of indirectly support Speaker McCarthy?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Democrats don't want to open this up to potentially, some other much more unattractive speaker candidate, who will try to reorganize the Republican caucus. So, yeah, I mean, they'll just walk off the floor and make it a different kind of vote. And so all of this, I've always thought the easy yes in the negotiation that the speaker had with the right-wing MAGA guys, getting the speaker's job, was to give them this option, because the reality is they may try to take the vote, but it's not going to result in his ouster. I mean, there's a difference between taking a vote and actually throwing the speaker out. And in this case, I think there's a zero chance that that if they do it, that Kevin McCarthy doesn't wake up the next day showing how hollow this is for them, right? It only works if they actually never force the vote, right? Because then they have influence. If they vote and they can't get rid of him, then they're dead, right? No, then the reality is it was a hollow argument.
How about that? Jeannie, I've got to ask you about the union. The UAW today scaling up these strikes against the big 3. Well, I should be more specific. It's against 2 of the big 3.
We had a noon deadline today, as you know. Sean Fain made the announcement before high noon.
We still have serious issues to work through, but we do want to recognize that Ford is showing that they're serious about reaching a deal. At GM and Stellantis, it's a different story.
Different story. Either way, Donald Trump will be there to speak to all of them next week, Jeannie. And now Sean Fain thinks that Joe Biden ought to come speak to union members. Is he right? Does the president head for Detroit?
You know, the president has to walk a fine line. I think he has issued very strong support for the strikers. I think that some of us were surprised by how strong he was in his language. And I, too, was struck, like Bill said, by the fact that Fain just last weekend on CBS Sunday show said, you know, the president, the administration should stay out of it. Now he seems to have changed that. I think in part that may be a response to Donald Trump's decision to go and to speak to workers. But I think we should caution everybody against this idea that workers will naturally line up with Donald Trump. The reality is the workers elected Sean Fain. This is a new UAW under Sean Fain. And if they feel well represented by him, they may follow the leadership, or enough of them may follow the leadership if they choose to endorse Biden, which of course they haven't done yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, Donald Trump will be skipping the Republican debate next week, apparently to do that in Detroit. We don't know if the president will join him, but we'll have a lot more with our panel on this next as we look ahead to the debate and new numbers out of New Hampshire today that could be meaningful. We'll talk about it with Rick and Jeannie after we get up to date on world and national news with Nancy Lyons now in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to the White House appears to have been productive. Bloomberg is learning the U.S. will provide a limited number of longer-range missiles to Ukraine so it can hit targets deeper in Russian territory. NBC News was first to report the deal. While Ukraine is adding to its capabilities, Russia is also planning to ramp up defense spending in a big way next year.
The draft budget for the Kremlin shows military spending will make up 6% of Russia's GDP next year. That's up from 3.9% now. Total defense spending will rise from $66.7 to $112 billion. Even with soaring war costs and massive sanctions, Russia still expects its revenues to jump 22%. Oil and gas revenues are predicted to grow nearly 25%. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
There is progress between the United Auto Workers Union and Ford Motors, but Union President Sean Fain says Stellantis and GM are refusing to budge. So he's asking workers to go on strike today against 38 Stellantis and GM parts distribution centers.
We will be everywhere from California to Massachusetts, from Oregon to Florida. And we will keep going, keep organizing, and keep expanding the stand-up strike as necessary. Across the country, people are going to know that the UAW is ready to stand up for our communities and ready to stand up against corporate greed.
The automakers say they cannot meet the union's demands because they're putting profits into the transition to electric car manufacturing. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries.
Profits, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. Little change right now on the S&P 500 index, up by 1 point. The Dow negative. It is down 65 points at 34,004. Down now by 0.2%. NASDAQ is up 35, higher by just about 0.3%. The NASDAQ 100 index up 62. That is a gain of 0.4%. Mild gains at the end of a jittery week that saw investors positioning for a higher for longer Federal Reserve stance. The 10-year 4.42%, with the 2-year yielding 5.10%. Spot gold up $5.50 the ounce to $19.25, up 0.3%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.4%, $89.95 right now for a barrel of WTI. Industry data suggests American business activity stalled this month. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The S&P Global Flash Index, covering manufacturing and services, dipped to the lowest level of the year. Backlogs contracted at the fastest pace in 3 years, reinforcing a picture of moderating demand. Inflation remains an issue, too, stemming from rising interest rates, fuel costs, and labor costs. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
And one area of concern for the U.S. economy, the auto workers' strike. Ford shares up by 2.7% right now. GM down 0.5%. Stellantis up 0.2%. As we have been reporting, GM and Stellantis are facing walkouts at 38 more facilities as talks with their workers' union failed to make headway, while Ford was spared the escalation after making progress in the negotiations. Our Nancy Lyons will have more on the auto workers' strike coming up in just a few minutes. Again, recapping here, stocks are trading mixed. S&P 500 index up 1 point, the Dow down 66, NASDAQ up 35. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, denounced Donald Trump's plan to visit Detroit and talk to the auto workers next week. That's his plan to counter-program the Republican debate. But Sean Fain now says that Joe Biden should come. He's inviting the president to join striking workers on the picket line as they ratchet up the strikes here against GM and Stellantis. That's the update, knowing we had this high noon deadline today. Not good for GM and Stellantis, I guess not worse for Ford, who, as you've been hearing from Charlie Pellet, watching shares rise today because Ford will not get an escalated strike. Let's reassemble the panel for a little bit more on this. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano join Bloomberg Politics contributors. We had Jeannie weigh in first. Rick, I'd like to hear from you on this and whether you think Joe Biden should seize the opportunity here, because we all know Donald Trump is. I don't know if we have Rick muted there, but there we go. Hey, Rick, if you can hear me? All right. Yep. I sure can. Should Joe Biden take the invitation to go to Detroit?
Yeah, I think Joe Biden should go to Detroit. He should be talking to the UAW guys. He should not have let Donald Trump get around him. I think it was a pretty sloppy political move by the Democrats to not see that coming. It's a perfect option for Donald Trump. Good excuse to skip the debate to go talk to these guys. And obviously it's a mixed match of, retired and active union members. So he's just putting together an event. He's not really going there to talk to the UAW. And Biden has made a career out of being the pro labor candidate, and so he's got to brandish that credential. There's nothing in it for him to be sort of nice to the corporations at this stage. And why not politically join the right protests and say, I feel for the blue collar workers who are getting abused by the corporations. To me, this is just a no-brainer. I don't know if it's good public policy, but it's great politics.
Yeah. Well, yeah, imagine the images, Jeannie. I know you think that this is a delicate equation for Joe Biden, but imagine him arm in arm, right, leading the charge. He's got the megaphone in his hand, a fist in the air. Is that not exactly what he needs now?
Well, I'm not sure he needs exactly that because he's also president of the United States. He's responsible for a stable economy. And striking against the big three can be interpreted by many people as something that is disruptive to the economy at a time when inflation is high. But, I think he does have a difficult line to walk, as anybody does. It's far easier, it's not easy, but easier to run for office and to slam everybody who's in control and power. But somebody like Joe Biden, who is president, has dual responsibilities, multiple, and a big one is to the economy. So, there's that, but I think that he did make a very powerful statement last Friday in support of the union. And the fact that Sean Fain is inviting him to go visit with union workers is testimony to that. I mean, there were some people who heard what the president said last week and said he sounded a bit like Bernie Sanders, maybe with a little less energy, right? His statement was very strong. So, in the piece that you played earlier on in the hour that they put out there, those are Republicans doing this. It is Donald Trump chasing Joe Biden's supporters. Donald Trump is trying to be a friend of the workers that Joe Biden has not just been in the last week for political reasons, but throughout his entire career. So I think that Joe Biden has an upper hand on this, and he has to remember first and foremost his responsibility as president to both the economy and to support the workers. And I think he can do both.
Well, he's got the upper hand in the latest polls out of New Hampshire. These new numbers are from CNN and the University of New Hampshire Survey Center. This is the Granite State poll, a sample of about 2,000 in the Granite State poll. And my goodness, these are hypotheticals for the general election between Joe Biden and every Republican candidate who's going to be on stage next week, plus Donald Trump. Rick, I know you don't have a lot of time for hypotheticals at this stage of the game here, but this is New Hampshire. It's UNH. And when you look at these numbers, my goodness, not good for Donald Trump. Joe Biden beats him by 12. He beats DeSantis by 17, same as Ramaswamy. Beats Haley by 16, Pence by 29, Christie by 24, and Scott by 13. What do these numbers tell you?
Yeah, well, I think you focus in on the Biden-Trump matchup because they've run against each other in New Hampshire. There are a lot of Republicans who think New Hampshire is a swing state, and I think that it's a legitimate poll at that stage. I mean, the rest of them don't have enough name ID and haven't campaigned enough, so it's very hard to make comparisons. But this Trump number is bad because everything that Biden's getting is motivated by Trump. The intensity that Biden's voters give him is because they don't want Trump to be president. Not that they want him to be president, they don't want Trump. Trump's negatives are really what's driving his numbers down. I mean, up over 60% negatives. I mean, he's only getting a little over 70% of his own ballot. I mean, he is a broken candidate in New Hampshire. And unless he changes himself, he's got no way to compete in New Hampshire.
And he beats everyone by more than that. Jeannie, the Biden camp has been in need of some good news. Is this it?
Yeah, this is absolutely good news for the Biden camp. And I think they are paying close attention to these polls because we heard the president speaking to funders and supporters in New York. And he is really turning his focus on Donald Trump to keep pushing these negatives up. And his argument is that Donald Trump wants to destroy democracy. He wants to increase the chaos and decrease any sense of normalcy and proper governance in a democracy. And that seems to be resonating with voters who are listening in places like New Hampshire. And this is one of the striking things about these early state polls. Donald Trump's support is down about 15% in these early state polls versus the national polls. And that's presumably because these voters are paying close attention. And the voters who are doing that are really not happy with what they're hearing from Donald Trump. And in New Hampshire in particular, about a third of Trump supporters said they would look elsewhere. So that puts his floor down about 25%. Bad news for Donald Trump, good news for Joe Biden in these head-to-heads. And they've got to keep making the case that you may not love Joe Biden, but look at the alternative.
Well, I'll tell you, a couple weeks ago, we would have been obsessing over this DeSantis number as well. Remember when DeSantis was the big fear? He's the one who actually could beat Joe Biden in a general. He loses by 17 points in New Hampshire, according to this poll. Some final thoughts next from Rick and Jeannie. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. The Federal Trade Commission is expected to sue Amazon.com for antitrust violations next week. This, according to sources, marking the agency's fourth swipe at the online retail giant this year. Amazon shares today little change, but they are pushing higher. Amazon up now by about 0.2%. McDonald's is bumping up the fees it charges American and Canadian franchisees to operate some restaurants. Owners who open new restaurants or buy locations previously run by McDonald's will have to pay the parent 5% of sales, up from the current rate of 4%, according to a message signed by CFO Ian Borden that was reviewed by Bloomberg. The rate will also apply to restaurants the company buys and then sells to an operator. Apple's latest iPhones are now on sale. And with more on that story, here's Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
Charlie, it's a test of whether a new smartphone design and modest smartwatch changes can help return the company to growth. The devices went on sale in about 40 countries in its first wave, including in Australia, Hong Kong, mainland China, the US, UK, and France. The iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max models will represent Apple's biggest sellers throughout the rest of the year, and the ability to both create and fulfill demand for the products will make or break its holiday period. Charlie?
And that's Steve Rappaport reporting. Microsoft's $69 billion acquisition of Activision Blizzard looks set to clear its final regulatory hurdle in the United Kingdom. And those are the top company stories that we're following for you at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Washington. We'll add Kaylee Lyons to the conversation in just 5 minutes. Right now, world and national news with Nancy Lyons. For that, we turn to the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez and his wife Nadine are facing bribery charges. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams with the Southern District of New York alleges the two took bribes from New Jersey business executives in exchange for influence.
The indictment alleges that through that relationship, the senator and his wife accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars of bribes in exchange for Senator Menendez using his power and influence to protect and to enrich those businessmen and to benefit the government of Egypt.
Williams says their investigation is not yet over. Menendez says he is being falsely accused. The Supreme Court could face new questions about its ethics. ProPublica is reporting that Justice Clarence Thomas has appeared at recent events sponsored by the billionaire-backed Koch network in hopes he'd be a fundraising draw. Bloomberg government's Zach Cohen with details.
There's an appearance here of Justice Thomas being used as a fundraising draw for a conservative group that typically advocates before the high court.
Bloomberg government Zach Cohen. The Koch network says Justice Thomas was not present for fundraising conversations at the events he attended. United Auto Workers President Shawn Fain says the union is expanding its strike against automakers GM and Stellantis by walking out at 38 plants in 20 states.
Across the country, people are going to know that the UAW is ready to stand up for our communities and ready to stand up against corporate greed.
UAW President Shawn Fain says Ford was spared additional strikes because he says the company has met some of the union's demands during negotiations the past week. The union is pointing to the company's huge recent profits as it seeks wage increases of 36% over 4 years. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Joe.
Hi, Nancy, thank you. We hear a lot about crime in major cities these days. And in New York, they've got a new tool to help the police. They rolled it out today, unveiled this today. It's called K5, a drone. And Mayor Eric Adams helped to unveil this piece of drone technology that'll help patrol New York's busiest subway stations. Yes, New York now has a RoboCop.
This is a good investment in taxpayers' dollars. And I'm hoping you're going to put a line in your story how cost efficient I am, because I should get that. This is below minimum wage. You know, no bathroom breaks, no meal breaks.
No bathroom breaks, no mirror breaks, but ready to deliver justice.
Drop it. That are alive, you are coming with me.
That's right. It is now our reality, ladies and gentlemen. RoboCop is among us. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. I'm going to have to think twice, I guess, when I go to New York. Jeannie, you're a New Yorker. There's going to be a cop walking along with the RoboCop. Does this bring justice to New York's subways?
Well, I certainly hope so, but I have to tell you, I shop at Stop and Shop sometime, and they have Murdy, the robot, who's eerily similar to this K5 robot. And he always freaks me out. So I don't know if I'm going to feel safe or more freaked out. And $9 an hour, they get to lease him. He should at least be paid more per hour. That's not even minimum wage.
You make that sound like a deterrent, Rick. I don't know about you. If you saw one of these things coming your way, would you turn and run? I feel like there's enough to worry about already in New York.
Yeah, I'm anti-RoboCop because you know what that leads to? Robo-thief. Oh. I mean, like, is this an escalation thing? I mean, like, you know, the police get a robo, the cops or the criminals get a robo. I mean, like, we're all going to be like just staying in our homes while the robos fight it out on the street. I mean, I'm not sure progress is a good thing.
Leave it to Rick and Jeannie to help us get to the bottom of this. Absolutely, yes. K5. It needs a friendlier name. By the way, it's taking pictures and video of you, but not audio, and no facial recognition. I think turn and run is going to be the answer for me. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Big thanks to Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Hour 2 of Sound On starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
The president's approval ratings are very low. The majority of Americans think he shouldn't run at all.
The 4 years Donald Trump was in the White House were totally different from 4 years that Biden has been there. People are going to say, I was doing better then than I am now.
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
So you got to work to get people back to work, but not only that, but to higher paying jobs.
The Russian threat is being degraded, and unfortunately it's being degraded at the cost of Ukrainian lives, blood, treasure.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
The auto strikes are getting bigger. Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On as the United Auto Workers expand strikes against GM and Stellantis, but not Ford. We're going to get the latest from Bloomberg Auto reporter Keith Naughton coming up, and we'll dive into the details of the negotiations and what might come next with Arthur Wheaton, Director of Labor Studies at Cornell University. The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is indicted in a federal corruption probe. We're going to look at the case against Senator Bob Menendez with Bloomberg Politics reporter Ryan Teague Beckwith. And later we'll spend some time with David Weston, of course, the host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, for more on the auto strikes and the chances of a soft landing. We've got a lot to cover, and we'll get to it as soon as we check on Wall Street. Let's start there on trading this Friday with Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Indeed, lots going on. Let's begin with those automaker stocks. We have got Ford up 2.6% right now. General Motors down 0.4%. Stellantis, the parent company of brands that include Dodge, Chrysler, and Fiat, Jeep as well. Stellantis up by about 0.2%. Treasuries are rebounding. Stocks are wavering at the end of a jittery week that saw investors positioning for a higher for longer Federal Reserve stance. On the week, looks like the S&P is going to be down by about 2.5% right now. The S&P is holding on to a gain, barely up less than 0.1%, higher now by 3 points. The Dow wavering down 25, a drop there of just about 0.1%. Turn and run for the Dow today. We have got NASDAQ up 32. That is a gain right now of 0.2%. 10-year yield, as I mentioned, 4.42%. The 2-year, 5.10%. Spot gold up $5.50 the ounce to $19.25, up 0.3. West Texas Intermediate crude right around the $89 a barrel level, $89.75 right now, up by 11 cents, higher by 0.1%. The U.S. and China are establishing 2 working groups to discuss economic and financial issues. The latest sign of a thaw in relations between the world's largest economies. Janet Henry is global chief economist at HSBC Bank.
I think we're not going to get any quick answers one way or the other on China. And we need to learn to live with that. You know, financial markets always want to know with certainty where things are going to be in 2 years' time, and they want to price it today. The fact is, in China, what we have seen recently is some signs of stabilization in the economy.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance Podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Again, as we've been reporting, GM and Stellantis are facing walkouts at 38 more facilities. GM shares down 0.4%. Stellantis up now by 0.2. Ford up 2.5%. We got more coming up on Sound On. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you. As always, welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, joined now by Kaylee Lines. Now, 2 hours, Kaylee, past the deadline. Indeed. It was high noon, and Sean Fain didn't wait. He announced it shortly after 10 that they're expanding strikes against GM and Stellantis. Ford must be feeling sort of proud today, although they're still striking Ford, just not expanding the strike against Ford.
Just status quo for Ford, because some progress in talks has been made there, where it hasn't been made in GM and Stellantis' case, which is why you're seeing this expansion. And we're starting to get some headlines from the automakers themselves in response to this, Joe. GM just put out a statement, it seems, saying UAW leadership is manipulating the bargaining process, that the strike escalation by leadership is unnecessary, though GM says they will continue to bargain with the union to reach a pact. Then Stellantis sends in an emailed statement. They still not have received a response to yesterday's offer, they say.
Right. That was the one that they said was no-go or not good enough or something, but we don't know what was in the offer, correct?
We know that what wasn't in the offer was the job security components that the union was looking for, evidently, because with Stellantis's case, there's risks that a number of facilities are going to shut down, and that security for those workers that could be affected is something that they're looking for. In the meantime, though, Joe, we got another, 5,600 workers on strike in addition to the 13,000 that already were?
Sean Fain talked about it, the director, of course, of the UAW, in a Facebook Live. Here's a taste.
We're expecting to stand up strike in response to the lack of progress in bargaining with General Motors and Stellantis. We will shut down parts distribution until those two companies come to their senses and come to the table with a serious offer. The members who will join the stand-up strike today are living testament to one of the injustices we are fighting against at the Big Three: tears.
Not getting easier here as we go. And based on what you just said from GM, this could actually get a lot more dicey over the weekend if they're going to start with this tit for tat here. Keith Naughton's been all over this. Bloomberg auto reporter joins us now with the latest from Detroit. Keith, I don't know if you saw this coming here, that GM and Stellantis would be the ones to take the brunt of the expanded strikes. I know Bloomberg was reporting earlier this morning that Ford might be onto something. Could we be in a world where they actually strike a contract deal, a tentative deal with Ford while they continue striking the other two?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like Ford is making, as the union said, real progress here. One analyst is predicting there could be a settlement at Ford as early as next week. The question is, will the Ford deal set the pattern for the other two, or will GM and Stellantis kind of dig in their heels? Ford has given significant concessions that Wall Street seems to be in favor of. The stock soared today while GM and Stellantis did not. It includes giving back cost of living adjustments that were taken away in 2009. Making temporary workers immediately full-time. There are a number of sort of good gets for the union in the Ford negotiations that they would like to see come from GM and Stellantis as well.
A new headline just out from Stellantis said they offered all full-time hourly staff $80,000 to $96,000 by contracts. And I guess, Joe, that is referring to the offer they made yesterday that was not responded to. In the case of both Stellantis and GM, though, Keith, it's parts distributors that this strike is now expanding to. All of them. 38 facilities in total, I believe, across 20 states. Can you just talk about why these facilities are important and what not having workers there is going to mean for these two automakers?
Yeah, so with this action, the UAW is literally taking the strike to the streets, because what this will do is interrupt the parts flow that go to dealers for car repairs. So if you take your car in for a repair, the part may not be there, and then you can't drive your car. So this will really test that public support that has weighed very heavily in favor of the union, because this is now going to inconvenience drivers throughout the country and dealers.
Keith, we don't have a sense of what the next deadline might be, do we?
They haven't set another line in the sand yet, since they just crossed today's line. But, the question now becomes, can this progress at Ford, and the fact that Ford was kind of rewarded for it by not having their strike widen beyond the one plant, can that serve as an incentive? It's a carrot and stick approach that the union is using here. Can that serve as an incentive to get GM and Stellantis to come along with what Ford has offered? That's the whole basis of this bargaining strategy. The UAW is trying to pit one company against the other to get the best deal.
It's fascinating. Keith, thank you. Great reporting. Keith Naughton, Bloomberg auto reporter, with us again on Bloomberg Sound On. I look forward to our next conversation. I'm pretty sure we're going to have it as we add the voice now of Arthur Wheaton, the Director of Labor Studies at the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Arthur, it's good to have you back on Bloomberg. We've had some pretty important developments here just over the last few hours. What did they tell you about the state of affairs here in these negotiations? Keith says it's pitting automaker against automaker.
Yeah, and it's using a strategy that the automakers have used against the union for years. The term's called whipsawing. So you try to, for decades, General Motors would try to pit one plant against another. If you give us a concession here, we'll give you more work. Now Sean Fain and the UAW is pitting one automaker against the other automaker, saying the first one to get a decent deal doesn't get a strike. And it's helping them in terms of their strike fund, because they're only paying for less than 20,000 UAW members out on strike, yet it's impacting severely both Stellantis and General Motors and their dealerships especially, without draining their strike fund as quickly as it could be.
So definitely some very strategic thinking at play here on the part of Sean Fain and UAW leadership. I guess the question becomes, if they are prepared to just not budge at all on their demands. That seems to be what's happening here, is that the automakers are having to move because the union just isn't doing that. I just wonder how long you think that dynamic is sustainable for.
I think what's likely to happen is both General Motors and Stellantis are waiting for Ford to find the solution for them, so that Ford is most likely to get a deal, and then hopefully that deal will set the pattern at the other two automakers. I think right now they're trying to battle the public relations war at General Motors and Stellantis more so than solve the problems at the bargaining table.
Huh. So Ford's being used by both sides here, Kaylee.
I guess so.
Actually fascinating, and as we watch
Taking
its
one for
stock
the team.
rise. Arthur, if this goes on, maybe there's a deadline next Friday, maybe they stand up strikes again, maybe this goes into a third week. Is a lockout among the options for these automakers, or is that signing your own death warrant?
The lockout became an available option the minute the strikes became an available option. So since all three contracts are what they call expired, the no strike, no lockout clause is ended. So they can do it anytime they want. I just don't think they want to. I think right now both GM and Stellantis are sitting back trying to wait and see, waiting for Ford to figure a way out of this, just like they did in Canada for Unifor. Unifor picked Ford as the target because Ford has historically been much better at managing labor relations and valuing that relationship.
So if it's really Ford's deal to make here at the end of the day, is there no role at all for any officials in the administration? We just had a headline coming out of the press briefing with the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre. She said U.S. officials spoke with the UAW and automakers both today. That's, of course, after earlier today, Sean Fain says, we invite everyone to the picket line, President of the United States included. Does the President of the United States make a difference in a situation like this?
Yes, the president can make a difference, but the biggest difference he can make is not trying to get into the bargaining table. So under the National Labor Relations Act, which is what the private sector is under, there is no role for the president or Congress. Unlike the rail industry, which almost had a strike, the Railway Labor Act does have a specific role for the president, and it was Congress that stopped that strike from happening. It's different in the private sector. The law was written to say the best deal is a gated deal, and they should have both sides work on an issue, try to solve it.
Do you expect, or should there be, Arthur, continued negotiating sessions, or is this going to be, here's my offer, no, I reject that, here's my offer, and we kind of play this out in the media?
So what happens is you can get to what they call last, best, and final offer, and that's what you could come to at Stellantis or at General Motors. But I don't think we're there yet. I think right now you're seeing an impact, and it's a relatively serious impact, but I don't think anything so far can't be made up by the end of the fourth quarter. So as you have only 3 assembly plants down, they can work overtime and catch up on all of that lost production. And the parts plants doesn't hurt production as much as it hurts the dealerships. And the dealerships are the primary customer for both GM and Stellantis, because GM and Stellantis do not own the dealerships. That is their customer. So I think the pressure right now is adding chaos to the system, but it's also having an impact without costing a huge amount to either the strike fund or gross domestic product in the U.S.
Yeah, that's an interesting point as we think about the economic ramifications of this. When we're talking about cost, though, obviously the cost to the strike fund is the consideration for the union, but the cost of the new contract is the consideration on the other side of the bargaining table for these automakers. The sense I am getting is that it isn't really so much about the wages. It's about other things related to pensions, for example, some of these higher cost areas. And if that's where the problem is, these companies, a couple of them, have gone bankrupt because of this same issue as before. I wonder how there can really be reconciliation on that issue.
I think there is a huge difference between what you ask for at the table and what you expect to receive. So you never ask for the minimum going into bargaining. You're going to ask for more. I don't think the pensions were solved at Ford. I don't think the healthcare for retirees was solved at Ford. And I don't know if they will be solved. I think those are just two issues. But what the UAW is doing is saying everything we're asking for here, we had for decades. They had a cost of living. They had a defined benefit pension. They had healthcare for the retirees. And those are just some of the things over the years they have given up to help save the companies. So I think it's a reminder. I don't think it's going to be last best and final offer. Give us the pension and the healthcare retiree, or we're all on strike and we'll take you all out right now for forever. I don't think they're at that point.
Wow. You referred to the strike fund already, Arthur. The automakers know how much money the union has, just like we do. Why not just put a date on the calendar for when that money runs out, sit back and wait?
Well, you could try doing that, but the UAW absolutely doesn't want to spend all of that. You got to remember, only 147,000 people are impacted directly by these three companies being.
But if you're the automakers, why not just let them spend the money? If you know when that money runs out, doesn't that give the corporations an advantage potentially?
Except that all your customers are going to start running to Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Kia, and whoever else they want to, and you start losing customers. And at $48,000, the average for each vehicle, it doesn't take many customers to surpass that number in the strike fund. So they could lose a whole lot more money than what the UAW will lose over that period of time.
It's an interesting consideration. And as Arthur's talking about different automakers, there's also Tesla, non-union.
Yeah.
EV maker. EVs are at kind of the heart of the issue in this fight as well. In theory, Tesla's probably feeling pretty good about this right now.
Yeah, we only have 30 seconds, Arthur. Is this whole thing advantage Tesla?
I would say no. I would say what's going to happen is all of this, if the UAW wins huge gains at the bargaining table, you could have the UAW start organizing more of the non-union
Tesla's going to organize.
Including Tesla. And Tesla is always anti-union and has unfair labor practices against them. So it could be a warning shot saying, look, we're coming to you next. So we want improvements for the workers.
Come back and talk to us. Arthur Wheaton, Cornell University, Director of Labor Studies. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. 221 now on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. S&P 500 index just turning negative in the red, adding to a losing week, down 4 points now at 43.25. Losses this September continue, with the S&P right now down by about 0.1%. The Dow lower by 65, down 0.2%. The Nasdaq Composite Index holding on to a gain right now of 4 points. Little change there, up by less than 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.42%. The 2-year 5.10%. Spot gold at $19.25 the ounce, up by about 0.3%. While West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.6%, $90.18 a barrel on WTI. Federal Trade Commission is expected to sue Amazon for antitrust violations next week, according to sources, marking the agency's fourth swipe at the online retail giant this year. Amazon shares, they're lower now, Amazon down by 0.3%. Tinder is rolling out an ultra-premium subscription tier to its dating app users, charging $499 a month to access features like exclusive search and matching. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
We talk about investing in gold here fairly often on Bloomberg, but that's usually, an ETF or, I don't know, maybe it's a futures contract, Kaylee. Maybe it's a gold miner, but not actual gold bars.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the Justice Department seems to think it found in Senator Bob Menendez's house, along with a lot of cash.
I was going to say, among other things.
Stuffed in his clothing. This is a bizarre story, although I guess for Bob Menendez, I'll reserve comment and let Ryan Teague Beckwith go there because, he's been indicted before. No, that's a good point, Ryan.
Senator Menendez has been indicted before.
This is the last thing you need is to worry about your reputation.
Just want to be clear about
here
that.
and Sound On. New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez indicted in federal corruption probe. The headline on the terminal. The pictures are everything, and we actually, we've got the indictment here. If you're with us on YouTube, the photographs of the cash on the clothing, of the actual gold bars themselves, is pretty great stuff, and you can see this on the terminal, of course, in our story. Kaylee, we heard from the prosecutor in this case. The
Southern District of New York.
U.S. Attorney Damian Williams announced the indictment earlier today in New York. Listen to what they found.
Now, as part of this investigation, special agents with the FBI executed search warrants on the residence and safe deposit box of Senator Menendez and Nadine Menendez in New Jersey. When they got there, they discovered approximately $500,000 of cash stuffed into envelopes and closets. Some of the cash was stuffed in the senator's jacket pockets. Some of the envelopes of cash contained Davies' fingerprints or Davies' DNA. That's not all. Agents also discovered a lot of gold that was provided by Davies and Hannah. And the FBI, of course, found the Mercedes-Benz that Uribe had provided them.
Nice Mercedes. We saw a picture of it in the driveway there.
Yep.
Does it help when the U.S. Attorney says best of all? Well, I don't know. We need Ryan's help.
Yeah.
Bloomberg Politics reporter Ryan Teague Beckwith. What's going to happen to the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee here?
Best of all, first of all, is gold bars.
Yeah,
Sorry.
okay.
Best of all is not the car.
Many
Lots
of
of people
them.
have the car, but not
gold.
a lot of
play
people have gold bars. I mean, that's Gringotts level wealth there.
A Harry Potter reference.
Yes.
Nice.
Look, there's two big problems here politically for Senator Menendez because he's survived being indicted before. Yeah. The first big problem is what I call the Al Franken problem. Al Franken, as you recall, Minnesota senator, some old photos came out of him acting inappropriately around women. Mm-hmm. He might have been able to survive it, but it was not only the middle of Me Too, but it was also the middle of Democrats trying to make the case that Donald Trump, acts inappropriately around women. Mm-hmm. So they just were not going to lose the advantage on the argument against Trump by, being too nice to one of their own who's accused of something in that vein. So Franken got frozen out right away by Democrats and ended up resigning, and is apparently, from all reports, somewhat bitter about all of this. So Menendez being accused of this kind of corruption when Democrats are literally making the case that Donald Trump is corrupt, and he's literally being indicted. He's not going to find any favor with Democrats on that, because why give up that for that? The second problem he has is the Chris Christie problem, which is the other reason why he survived last time, was that Chris Christie was the governor. And if he were to resign, then they might have had a Republican appointed to that seat. Chris Christie could have appointed himself to that seat. Yeah. Wow. That's not the case right now. So there's kind of double trouble for him there, that politically there's no reason for Democrats to bail him out on this, and doing so would hurt them. So politically, that setting aside the criminal problem that he faces.
Just because you were talking about the comparison with Donald Trump, when I got the statement in my inbox from the senator today in response to this indictment, the opening sentence: "For years, forces behind the scenes have repeatedly attempted to silence my voice and dig my political grave." And I thought, that sounds kind of familiar. Is this a True Social post? Just in rhetoric. It kind of feels similar to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the Trump playbook of responding to things by saying they're just trying to silence me, this is a conspiracy, this is weaponization of the Justice Department, I think that has metastasized. I think that that's kind of what you're just going to see now routinely. I don't think it's going to work in this case. I don't think it's super effective to be like, Joe Biden is weaponizing the DOJ against me, a Democratic senator. Right. But, it doesn't mean you can't try. He doesn't have a lot. There's not a lot of good defenses here. Who among us hasn't left $100,000 in